life is a spiritual battle between good and evil, you start to see what he's talking about, and Passio is really saying the very same thing. And so, on episode 1, it struck me that the power process that the world is starving for is the great work, is the spiritual challenge that we have in front of us to help the population rediscover their sovereign self, their sovereign rights as sovereign beings. Thanks for joining us. Got a big episode for you here today. If you want to follow along in the show notes, head over to synthesismeaning.me, podcast section, podcast 2. We get into the meat of the Unabomber story, so I hope you enjoy it, and we'll catch you on the other side. Managed to get some feedback to me on both episode 0 and episode 1, so I will respond to that in our feedback section. Carry on here. So one of the comments was that it sounds an awful lot like I'm trying to make an absolute claim when I say things like I can see all the darkness. That's quite a black and white extreme statement, and I have to be honest that I have no claim to any absolute claims. All I'm claiming is relative to my own path. So when I say things like I can see all the darkness, there's a half a sentence left out there, which is relative to what I could see 5 years ago. So I will catch myself and be careful about that. I'm not having a messianic episode a la David Koresh. I'm just very, very pleased with my own progress and my own journey, and I'm just comparing my experience to my own path. So I hope I clear that up. I caught myself on a few important points, so I think I'll just introduce the idea here, and then when we get into the macro section, I'll get into some of the more details. But, well, I guess I can say that to give a little background on the inspiration of the podcast is twofold. One is the value of the concept of shadow work and the experience I mentioned on episode 1 of having group calls where you're comparing the trends and observations you're having in your own life and often frustrations. And when you step outside of that and talk to others and find out that you're not alone, others are on the same journey, it really helps create some distance between the daily happenstance of your life and kind of observe and get into observer or witness mode, which is a much more constructive place to be. So I wanted to share that. I wanted to share it, and I wanted to reproduce it. So that's what the intent of the micro conversation is. It's really sharing trends and observations and insights, and then hoping that we can create a feedback loop around that, and hopefully that what I'm seeing, others are seeing, and we can I'll sometimes have a question, sometimes have a comment or a theory, and hopefully we can help each other rise above it all and continue to progress on our paths. So that was the idea on the first half. The second half was really, I don't know, I think it was Michael Sarion that articulated it extremely well. And I don't have that quotation, but it's something along the lines of studying history is studying the psyche. I mean, when you get really interested in a certain episode of history or a certain event and you dig into it, it means it's a puzzle piece in your own psyche. It's a mirror for what's going on in your micro. So in my case, there's over the years, certain stories have really grabbed me, like the JFK assassination. And then this past 6 months, I mean, that's partly why I wanted to do these together. There are two forms of shadow work. One is the macro version, one's the micro version. So when we're talking about Unabomber, that's an episode in history that really, really grabbed me. There was the Stockholm Syndrome story, which really grabbed me. There was Ruby Ridge, really grabbed me, Waco. So there's a bunch of these that, even the Benghazi story, I found quite riveting. So it made me want to dig in deeper and understand fact versus fiction and make sure I got the full lesson from that episode in history. And I wanted to invite others along on that journey as well. So it's two aspects of shadow work, and that's really the inspiration for the podcast, bringing those together and in an attempt to continue to learn and progress on the journey to rise above it all and come into our own as sovereign beings. I think along with that discussion of that journey, so this fact versus fiction, this is what I caught myself with. I think is happening is, like in the case of the Unabomber TV show, they will start the episode with a graphic bomb incident, which is, traumatic to witness, and then they'll slip in what looks like facts from the case, like very, very specific. So as a viewer, you tend to take those on board as undisputed facts, and that's what I caught myself. There's a few facts. I'll get into the details when we're starting the second half, but there were a few facts that I recited in episode 1 as if they're facts, and I'm just taking them from TV, actually, which is embarrassing to admit, but they got me there. So I'll make sure I'm clear about those, about how firm those are, and maybe they are accurate, but I shouldn't say them like they're accurate when I've never looked at court documents or objective anything that didn't come straight from official transcripts. Should probably be cross-checked. So I'll get into that in the second half. So this journey actually has been very interesting. It's been an interesting journey, and the people in the Facebook group that's related to our website have been along for the ride. When I had the illness that I spoke about in episode 0, so maybe that might have been 3 or 4 years ago, as I mentioned then, it really made me want to dig into what's underneath it all. I came to the conclusion there's an aspect of reality I just couldn't comprehend, because I couldn't comprehend that there's some highly intelligent people that architected a health system to deliberately kill people. or a food chain, that was just driving me crazy. So I became obsessed with, I really need to understand what's going on. I can't comprehend the psychology of anybody that would do this on a mass scale. And so that's the initial Facebook group, was understanding the nature of reality. And that sent me down a number of rabbit holes that were extremely gratifying, and the puzzle pieces were fitting, and I'm connecting with like minds, and that's an important part of the journey. But I got to a certain point where the Peterson message was pulling me even more. Like, I guess I had kind of done my journey. I felt at the time that I had done the journey on some of the more conspiratorial tracks and rabbit holes, and I wanted to kind of come out of that and head down the rules for life and the spirituality for atheists. And that, not that I was an atheist, but the fact-based nature of those teachings really grabbed me. So the maps of meaning and that kind of thing. Peterson was really resonating with me. And so I changed the nature of my pursuit because I realized also that there's a limit to the rabbit hole journey, and it's extremely isolating, and it tends to make others appear like nobody's down that rabbit hole with you. So people start to look like barriers to your progress. So it definitely is tempting to get paranoid, and it's definitely tempting to get alienated. And so I thought the Peterson message at a certain point was a healthier path, and it was more integrative, and that worked for me. And that was when I changed the group to understanding the nature of meaning. And that's been a great journey. And now just recently, I got back to Mark Passio, and it dawned on me on episode 1 when I was reading the Unabomber Manifesto to you that these are all coming together. that Peterson, and I think Passio hasn't said it in these words, but I think he would, that the nature of our existence is fundamentally a battle between good and evil. It's a spiritual battle between good and evil. And when you hear somebody that's kind of religious right, if I can use that expression, or orthodox religious saying something like that, it's a real turnoff, and you just don't think that person is in touch with reality. But when you follow the journey that Peterson takes you on, and he gets to a point where he says, fundamentally, life is a spiritual battle between good and evil, you start to see what he's talking about, and Passio is really saying the very same thing. And so, on episode 1, it struck me that the power process that the world is starving for is the great work, is the spiritual challenge that we have in front of us to help the population rediscover their sovereign self, their sovereign rights as sovereign beings. And so the problem that the Unabomber was trying to solve, which is people are completely atomized, automatized, emasculized, impotized, if that's not a word, and they're looking for the power process. They need autonomy, they need to challenge their abilities, and they need a challenge that's important. And that's really, while I was reading that, it dawned on me that is the great work that Passio talks about. That's the spiritual awakening, which Peterson did his own version of that. And so the pieces come together when you conclude that reality is a spiritual experience, and you buy into the premise that we are at an extremely spiritually lost state. Those of you that haven't found your power process, I think that you will find it in your own spiritual journey, and sharing that with your community, whatever that means to you. So I thought that was quite an epiphany for me, that the problem that we can see is solved by taking up a torch and grabbing whatever piece of it speaks to you, and and switching your own lights on and trying to switch on the lights of anyone you can reach. So that's exciting to me. It's what's the quote by J.K. Rowling? Something like rock bottom is a very solid foundation to launch your life, something like that. And rock bottom's a very solid foundation to launch the great work. But I think that's the ikigai for the population. I think that's what we're faced with. So I'm interested to get your feedback. Let's do the tarot card, set the tone, get the vibe, and see if the new fresh deck can enlighten us on the vibe for the period. Let's see here. Okay, what do we got? What do we have? Wow, that is unbelievable. I just shuffled a lot. Nobody saw that, but I think you probably could hear it. I just shuffled a lot. I can't believe that. That is again, a ton of bricks over my head. It's the Two of Swords again, if you can believe it, blindfolded with the swords over her back. So I'll read it again. What I liked was the comment, which I never spent any time on the last episode, Concord in Arms. It was kind of interesting. I was talking a lot about discord, and then the tarot came up with Concord in Arms, which must be the opposite of discord. It must mean, alignment when you're under duress, which is also what the great work is all about. So let's see if we can. Two of Swords, a hoodwinked figure. So that blindfolded. I mean, anybody that remembers from the first episode, this is of course going to be identical. Two swords upon her shoulders. Divinatory meaning, conformity, and the equipoise, which it suggests: courage, friendship, affection, concord in a state of arms, intimacy. The dark side of the card, if it's upside down: imposture, falsehood, duplicity, disloyalty. Wow, that's really freakish that came up. But again, it's integrity and alignment in your relationships and in your life. Concord in a state of arms. And to me, that's what natural law brings. Natural law brings the alignment. So we'll get into that in the next episode. Courage, friendship, affection, concord in a state of arms. Intimacy. There you go. So that's the vibe. There's definitely a strong message coming there from my new deck. All right. So I will share what patterns and experiences I've noticed in the microcosm. I'm a little bit unique situation in terms of my geography, but I think in some ways it might make some of the observations more stark because of the mixed cultures I'm living in. But it's hard to say. I think so. I notice certain things when I get back to the West and back to the first world. Macrocosm, we'll get as far as we can. I think we'll aim to read 50 to 80 paragraphs. I'll tell you what I learned from finishing the book. And we probably will need to spend some time in episode 3 wrapping that up and debriefing. And then we've got answers from episode 1, and we've got the quiz for next week. Here's a little reminder of the standing format. So the standing format is, we're already well into it here: feedback, announcements, enhancements, etc. The tarot pull we did, the microcosm, I'll talk about what I've been observing. And we've got the 2 sets of guests lined up for the next 2 episodes. So I'm looking forward to that. And then I've got a little bit of, I want to queue up the Unabomber piece. I'll explain that when we get there. And then we'll finish with the answers from last week and questions for next episode. I just kind of plunked in the microcosm, macrocosm trees of life. As we progress, I think this is going to become more and more meaningful, but I want to just keep it front of mind. I'm using it for my wallpaper on my laptop and my wallpaper on my phone. Until we master it, we'll just keep reminding ourselves and going back to it. I think it'll be powerful once we get using it. Okay, so what have I noticed? Well, I guess not surprisingly, I notice technology, partly because of this focus on the Unabomber story and the effect it has in our lives. One aspect, and this has been going on big time in the last week or so for me, but these increasingly complex passwords, increasingly, degrading memories. My memory's okay, I think, for my age, and I think the fitter and healthier I am, the sharper it is. But still, it's not what it was when I was 25. I think that this CAPTCHA thing, this whole thing, you're not a robot, and the face recognition, I think I'll get into that when we talk about AI before we start I think that's better, before we start the Unabomber piece. This is a huge point, this professional care. I don't know how all this is happening, but it's partly that the loyalty, there's just so many bad managers, for one thing. So this idea that, say, let's just keep it simple. You're a barista at a coffee shop. You've got at least two loyalties. One is you've got the commercial loyalty. Well, let's go through a list of them. You've got the commercial loyalty to the shop. So, economics, you want to gently upsell, you want to be honest about the cash, you want to just improve the business commercially. That's one of the aspects you're doing. But you're also a barista. You belong to a profession, and that profession has standards. So that means, a certain level, depending where you are. Let's just assume it's a top quality coffee shop. There's levels of quality in the brewing and in the processing and in the hygiene and everything else of the equipment and the workspace and everything. Those are in natural tension. You've got a loyalty to your profession, that there's a certain high standard, and then you've got loyalty to the business to make sure that there's no waste. So then you've got, you want to keep your customers happy and keep them coming back, and then you've got whatever your own ideals and values. Those are at the base of it all. So, and there's probably values for the shop. There's a certain culture they're trying to engender. Well, it just seems that increasingly, and I think this might be most roles, I don't know if people are just so desperate for a decent job that they're slavish. Sorry to use that word again, but they're really slavish to the commercial. They're just slavish to a tyrannical manager. Let's be honest. That's what it is. They're slavish to a tyrannical manager. So a lot of those other aspects become secondary. And then there's this other thing where I don't know how this works. You see somebody come in that's 25 years older than you, that's, I'm not talking about, let's just assume you're talking to each other like you're equals. You don't think that person has stolen their success from you and you deserve to, say, take a tip when they're not looking because, after all, you need it more than they do, like that. This is an experience that I had a couple of times. This was maybe in the summer, but these people that are in these lower level jobs, sometimes doing a great job, but there's a jealous envy against their own customers, not a gratitude, not a okay, the reason I have this job, the reason my employer is able to pay me is this person's coming in and paying a very high price for a very high quality product, and let's just keep this person coming back so everybody gets their piece. But it's not like that. It's like, who does this person think they are, coming into this shop and paying $5 for a drink? They're not going to miss it if I take an extra whatever one, and I'm the one that's on I'm the one that needs the money. They're not going to miss it. And if they don't miss it, then they never should have had it in the first place. It's like really, really, to me, that's like when you're traveling in a very dodgy place where people are ripping people off in the markets. I mean, most cultures evolve out of that. And first world, I mean, we're supposed to be way beyond that. And I had that experience a couple of times in Western Canada. And it's coming back around. And to me, it's socialistic ideals, and it's income distribution, and it's lack of professional acumen, and it's lack of ethics. It's all those things combined into one. One trend that's going on in Western Canada is the ATM point of sale. They're making the customers go through a number of screens of tip choices for the simplest, like for coffee, for delivery pizza, things where you're not having table service. So to replace the tip jar, so understand that these roles are getting less tips because people are carrying less change. But they're making you go through this levels of suggested tips for something that's just cash register. There's no table service. So it's creating this like expectation on the part of the working staff in these retail outlets that if you skip through those screens, then you're a cheapo. When we've all, in my experience, you don't tip unless it's table service. I mean, table service, and then, you tip decently, and if they go above and beyond, you tip above and beyond. There's no like, generally, there's no expected 20% tip on everything, including, ordering a delivery pizza. So I think this is a trend of socialistic values, and I don't know what it is in Europe. I'd love to hear from people in Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, if what's happening with that, because you're typically ahead of us on some of these trends. And so along with this, okay, so not so much that point about the tips, but the point before about the loyalty to the tyrannical manager. I could tell you stories about even staying in pretty decent hotels. You're checking out. You've paid everything. You were a good guest, and everything was fine, and everybody's happy. And they make you wait, for one thing, to pay your bill, if that's not the craziest concept ever. But not only that, I've had a few times, please wait. Did you take anything from the minibar? No, I didn't touch the minibar. Please wait here. We're going to go check your story. Okay, so they're telling you to your face, we don't trust you, and we don't care about how long you have to wait. We're going to go make sure you didn't steal a soda, or drink a soda and forget to tell us or whatever. So it's just the idea, focus on value, and the focus on loyalty, and the focus on customer service in some places is really deteriorating, and it's becoming a bean counter, a war of the tyrannical bean counter, and that's disappointing. I would expect that we'd continue to compete on greater and greater customer care, but that's what I've seen. Anyway, that particular one wasn't recent, but this war on competence. So they're cost reducing the staff. So let's take now this may be more unique to this region, but I don't think so. So you take a decent cafe, and to save money, they're hiring people that don't care that much about coffee, don't care to learn about it, don't care of the art form, and so they're squeezing the economics, but immediately the customer's experiencing a fraction of the quality that you would get if you got a real trained professional barista. I'm just using a simple example. It's happening in a lot of different services, but it's like, and I think, well, it's in the favor of tyrannical management. If there is tyrannical management, it's in their favor to not have a competition on professional acumen. It's better for them if they're if the staff are competing for the lowest wage. But I mean, how long can that last before you lose your entire customer base, no matter what your brand is? Anyway, that's one of the trends I've been seeing. This other one, the idea, and it's a form of adultism, I guess you could say, but it's a pet concept. So the husband, let's say, or the boyfriend, but let's say in this example, the husband somehow is okay with the wife treating him like a son. Okay? Whatever you can imagine that would be. And the wife is okay with the husband treating her like a child. So maybe monitoring her, giving her a GPS, monitoring her whereabouts, for example. And in the case of the husband, maybe she's going through his messages whenever he comes home. Okay? And both are okay with this. Okay? So they're willing to give up their individuality for this. It's like a parent-child relationship, two-way, and they think it's sweet, and I guess they think that's independent, or intimate, but that's not sweet. It's psychotic. You have a partner who wants to monitor your every move, and doesn't trigger a conversation of honesty. Instead, it triggers monitoring and control. You're heading towards psychosis, in my way of thinking. Anyway, so the second last one is, and the best way I can put this is, people are increasingly disturbed. And this is, they've been traumatized, whatever they're watching, whatever their upbringing has been, that's partly it. They're just uneasy with their inner self. And so they are so unbelievably outer focused. And I think I mentioned this in the previous episode about compete and compare. So they're also doing the compete and compare. And that makes them outer focused as well. And when they see somebody who's more integrated, they just have an unbelievable urge to disturb that person. So again, with the thinking, I believe, this is just a theory, but I believe the thinking is, that person looks like they're more at peace than me. They have taken that peace. They don't, whatever is giving them that peace, I want it back. So they were literally, just an example on airlines. How often you have long haul flight, 10 hours or 12 hours, you can't imagine how frequently the crew will wake you up and unapologetically, okay? And some of those crew are salt of the earth. They're unbelievably great people, but it's like, I'm awake. It's completely unapologetic. So to me, I take this as, you're disturbed, and when you see someone at peace, you want to disturb them, so they join your disturbance. So that's how it seems to me. So the other thing, yes. So shoelaces, oh my gosh, or leaving phones. They think they're being helpful. You set your phone down beside you, or your keys or whatever, and they want to come and tell you that your phone is beside you, and they think they're being helpful. They're just so obsessed with the outer. And I think they think that that's what present moment awareness is. That's not present moment awareness. That's obsessing over meaningless minutia. Okay? Present moment awareness, to my understanding, is what's happening inside of you largely. So how is whatever's happening in the outer being reflected internally? It's a very oneness oriented witnessing. It's not, your shoelace is untied. You just went through airport security and your shoelace is untied. I know it looks like you're walking to a chair to sit down and fix that, but I'm going to stop and tell you anyway. It's not helpful. So I just think it's OCD. It's unbelievably outer focused. And so it's screaming. People want to repossess their bodies. They want to get back into resonance with themselves, and they don't know. When they see someone else that's a bit more integrated. They want to disturb that. I have no idea how, in God's name, you can help a population like that. But I guess you could say all the distractions are promoting like an ADD culture for sure. But how do you get people to want to get back to that? I mean, even some of these Eastern cultures, not even, a lot of these Eastern cultures that like invented meditation and things and present moment awareness, they're the most disturbed of all. I don't understand. But anyway, I'm open to suggestions how to heal that divide. This idea of white knights now. White knights is an expression they use in like dating. So for example, but I mean I've seen it in so many just in general, let's just put it this way. In general, people are starting to get the idea that it's never okay to be angry. I think there's a few different things. Less and less people have a father in their home, or that less and less, let's say they have less healthy masculine energies in their homes. So that when somebody is stern with them, which is a typical masculine energy, they're uncomfortable with it. It's not something they grew up with. So that's one thing. So I think culturally, there is an idea that's spreading that all anger is bad. You're never supposed to stand up for yourself. You're never supposed to defend anything, stand against anything. It's supposed to be always no judgment, always acceptance. It's a pacifism kind of mentality. So if someone sees someone else standing up, let's say it's in a customer service situation where something's gone wrong with, like, there's been misconduct on the part of the operator, the vendor, and there's a customer saying, listen, this isn't okay. You're not operating on the up and up here. This is not all right. We got to sort this out. Everyone that sees that conversation seems to think that person's defending themselves. They must be in the wrong. You know what I mean? They're saying this. And the white knight's expression comes from this idea. It's typically extremely infantile-minded men that they see a woman upset, they don't ask any questions. They just assume whatever she's upset about is justified, and they come to her rescue like a damsel in distress, regardless of whether she wants that or not. But this white knights, I see that dynamic everywhere. So if you decide to stand up for something, maybe it is airport security, or maybe it's like a customer service example or an airline, and you say, listen, this isn't okay. Whatever it is, this isn't all right. The judgment from people around you tends to be, unreasonable customer, without even having any idea what's happening. And it really rattles some of the younger people that aren't used to a stern conversation of any kind. They get extremely rattled, and they immediately just conclude you're a bad guy, or you're an angry person. So the point here is a few things. One is, just because a woman's upset doesn't mean she's in the right. I don't have a specific example on that. But the other is, just because someone's taking a stand doesn't mean they're in the wrong at all. So the trend of like make no waves, go with the flow, never say anything, never stand up for anything, never stand against anything, that's like unbelievably dangerous, slippery slope. I guess I'm not sure why I put this on the same line, but this idea of winning, the first time I heard it was Charlie Sheen. I don't know if he was saying it jokingly or not, but it absolutely meant nothing to me at the time. It was, but now I understand that there are a lot of people going through their life, and where they get their momentary meaning from is they're keeping a little score. They're inventing little games for themselves to compete at, and they're keeping a score, and then they're declaring winning. And that's what this Instagram culture is, and the social media showing off culture, some of it is about, and it's unbelievably dangerous. Well, for one thing, if you want to have a competition, get into a competition. Judges and clocks and competitors and challenges, and something where it actually counts. But inventing a competitive game in your head where you're the scorekeeper and the judge and the ref, and you also reinvent the rules as you go, and you don't tell anybody else what the competition is or who's winning or how much time is left in the clock or anything. That's psycho. It's just psychopathic. That's just the best way to put it. So when people are saying they're winning, I know sometimes it's just a tongue-in-cheek thing, and it is kind of funny, but it's not entirely a joke. I mean, there are people that are going through their entire lives with a little competition that's completely meaningless, and it's so isolating, and it just throws all codes of conduct right out the window because you've invented a game that you want to play for keeps or whatever. Anyway, it's disturbing. We'll get into more about that in future episodes. To me, the solution, this is why I'm finding the Mark Passio content so unbelievably comforting at the moment, because it actually does just the simplicity of natural law, and I think we're going to get into it in this episode, helps you get your priorities straight. Let's put it that way. And it's so unbelievably simple, but there's a lot of unlearning around it. I think the scarcity mindset, that's when you get people into very weak mindsets, where they're willing to backstab their friends and spy on their peers and do all kinds of things that tyrannical management can ask for when they think that time equals money, and they're both extremely limited. So that's another control system that makes people behave very, very badly against one another. And when you do occasionally get yourself into a mindset of abundance, I think that's I'm just getting glimpses of it once in a while. I'm as programmed as anybody, or I have been. And but this abundance mindset, I think that's the answer for peace and healing. But it takes a lot of work to snap out of the cages. So that's the focus. And when I say belief system pushes things away, what I mean is if you believe in scarcity, if you're attached to that belief, you're going to see it everywhere. And so abundance won't land on your door if you're constantly resonating with a scarcity belief system. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to get to. We're trying to dismantle the cages of these, the money mentality, the scarcity, the time, and move towards a spiritual abundance mentality. So that's the goal. Communing with higher levels, I think I'll save that. That's actually going to be a topic for some guests in one episode, so I think we'll save that for now. I've mentioned that this scarcity mindset also, it creates the envy and jealousy. So people think if you've got like one tiny thing that looks more than them, whether it's peace or it's material or it's whatever, they conclude that you took it unfairly, which I think must be a projection, because that must mean that they're willing to take whatever they can get their hands on. So there was the debate, this is like a couple of years ago, but somebody got a promotion at work. I said, that guy's just a complete snake in the grass. All he does is backstab his peers and self-promote. That's what he does. And whoever I was telling the story is like, yeah, you got to hand it to him, though. He got the promotion. And I'm like, no, you don't got to hand it to him, though. The end, this is the end justifies the mean mentality. And absolutely not. I think we have to get calling each other out on these transgressions for any kind of code of conduct. But all of these things, this is actually a good reminder. At some point in the last episode, I said something like the natural order. I said that a number of times. When I say natural order, I'm talking about natural law, which we're going to discuss in the questions of this episode. But most people probably, when they hear natural order, they think of the concept natural selection, which is kill or be killed, dog eat dog. And that's the exact opposite. That's the exact opposite of natural law. So we will talk about that. But all of these control systems are trying to push people into this mentality of dog eat dog. That's where they want you, because you're needy and you're controllable, and you'll backstab your peers, you'll backstab your neighbors, and it's disgusting. It's just not the world we want to live in. That's the tiptoe towards hell that we're trying to avoid. So that's the gist. Okay, so I explained that I got a little bit duped with the Unabomber TV show, and I have noticed this tactic happening in a couple other films and TV series where they kind of traumatize the viewer with something very graphic, and that sort of just opens you up for suggestion, and they slip in something that looks like indisputable facts. That's what it looks like, and that somehow goes right into you're in an acceptance state after a subtle or not subtle but a mild trauma on the screen, and they can right into your belief system practically. So it's just made me think that I should share some discernment tests that have worked for me. It's not cut and dried, but I find it helpful actually to know kind of when to not go too far, because trying to get to the bottom of some of these stories it's a bottomless pit. So you have to decide at some point, okay, I've got the general gist. I kind of have an idea of the motive, means, and opportunity. And then there's some tests, basically. So one of the very useful concepts that came out of the Peterson-Harris debates from 2018. So Sam Harris, he is an intellectual that he's referred to as one of the four horsemen of the modern atheists, and very witty, very intelligent guy. And he and Peterson started to tangle. Sam has a podcast, and the most requested guest from Sam's base was to get Peterson into his podcast. So they eventually arranged it, and Peterson has a different worldview. He subscribes to something more like pragmatism, which is a U.S.-born philosophy, actually, which could take a whole episode to explain. I looked into it quite deeply maybe 6 months ago, and I'm not to the bottom of it, but I got the general gist, and I really like the concept. But the concept is basically, if it works in reality, then it is true. The test is the functionality, where Sam is kind of, I guess you could say, the current mainstream scientist Newtonian view of reality, where there's a total separation between consciousness and the reality, and you can, through the scientific method, you can learn all you need to learn, and you could even discover and develop a moral system. And that's kind of what he advocates. One of his books is called The Moral Landscape, which he used that image to think about, like, let's just agree as a human race that there's certain troughs in the moral landscape that are intolerable. We've gotten to a point where we know there's certain practices that are intolerable, and let's just agree as a human race that there are limits to there's a floor in human rights worldwide, and so he was promoting an atheistic, scientific, almost based morality, and developing that, which he hasn't fully developed, but the concept, the thinking he's developed. So anyway, those two tangled. Sorry, a small digression there, but it was an unbelievably rewarding journey to follow. They had 2 podcast debates on Sam's show, and then they had 4 public appearances. They were selling out stadiums, like 5,000 people, and it's all on YouTube for free, and it's riveting if you're into that kind of thing. And but one of the great kind of
phrases that came out in the early encounters was this idea of a metaphorical truth, that there are certain things that are useful, whether or not they're factually true, they're still useful to guide your life. So an example was everything happens for a reason. That's a belief that a lot of us subscribe to, and it really helps when something terrible happens. It really helps you move on and think, well, I'll see the meaning of this in the future. And you often hear people saying, it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me, those kinds of things. The idea of metaphorical truth, the best example they used to illustrate the point was when people are teaching gun safety. They teach every single gun owner, they teach them to always handle a gun as if it's loaded. Even if you know the barrel is empty, you've checked it 3 times, and maybe your partner's checked it as well, and everybody in the room knows it's empty, you still handle it as if it's loaded. It's just a good metaphorical truth to live by. I think that concept is helpful with some of these conspiracies. So take 9/11. Eventually you can find yourself down a bottomless pit of facts, but you can get to yourself to a point where you think you have the gist enough to get the metaphorical truth of what happened. And now you kind of have a new chunk in your armor, a new chink in your armor of how things are working. Something that's as huge as that. And you can conclude, you can look at, just like a crime, what was the motive, means, and opportunity, and then what was the implications? What took place? If you just kind of draw a black box around the event and just pay attention to motive, means, opportunity, and then outcomes. What happened because of that event? And then you can dig into the facts to the point that satisfies you to get a metaphorical truth that's useful. And that's basically one of the mechanisms that I use to get myself to a point of, okay, I think I've looked at this enough. I've got the general gist. I've got the truth to the point that it's most useful to me now, and I can always go back if I have more questions. The metaphor that I like to use is just like when you go into the eye doctor and they're testing your eyes and they're flipping lenses. I know this is like mechanical, so some of the new ones are more electronic, but the mechanical ones where they're flipping lenses and you're looking at the screen, they'll say, is it better or worse? Is it better or worse? Is it better or worse? And they're flipping up and flipping down, flipping up and flipping down. That's a test that I use when I'm asking myself about the truth of a situation. Does the world make more sense if I believe this, or make less sense? And just like a lens. Okay, if I put that lens on, it actually makes sense of a whole lot of these threads. It explains a lot of threads that I'm carrying around that don't make any sense otherwise. And that has helped me getting closer and closer to a more solid understanding of some of these conspiratorial stories. I think you absolutely have to jump into the ones that grab you the most. But there's a point where you think you have the black box boxed off and you can develop a metaphorical truth that's useful to guide you on that story, and you can kind of park it there and carry on with that lens selected, and then never forget that it can always evolve as facts emerge. But I've found those kind of mechanisms useful for me. So some of the other stories, one of the reasons I would say the people like Peterson doesn't go anywhere near Michael Sarion or Mark Passio, I don't entirely blame him, because he's trying to maximize his impact. And if he associates himself with guys that have gone public with some theories on aliens, is a risk that he could just get marginalized, and then his message won't hit the mainstream the same effect. If you do go down those tracks with David Icke or Michael Sarion or Mark Passio and some of the more tangential or more, controversial concepts they present, you don't have to get too caught up in it. Just study it enough to get your metaphorical truth. So the ones I've listed here, this reptilians, that can easily just be a metaphor for people who are purely satanic. They'd eat their young. They're completely psychopathic. They're cold-blooded. It doesn't have to actually be shapeshifters. You can stop there. You don't have to. Same thing, Michael Sarion, a big piece of his work was the Irish Origins of Civilization. He has a book called of the same title, and with a lot of proof around the. I'll try and share it on the podcast links. There was an ancient advanced culture in Ireland that he has evidence that migrated to Egypt. They brought a lot of those advanced technologies to Egypt. So that's that's one theory that would make a lot of people reject everything he ever says just because they have a hard time with an alternative history. But look into it to the point that's helpful for you, and then that's what I would recommend. And cosmic abandonment, that's another one. I think they both have a version of that, and that's probably one of the most crazy ideas compared to the mainstream. But they're researchers and they've got facts, so look at their facts and then decide what works for you. That's my advice and the same thing with the Unabomber. I'm going to try and delineate what we know factually from the Hollywood. It's so difficult sometimes, some of these stories, and they're coming through the media. One other just little aside, I did get some feedback that I'm enjoying. I think it's really going to helpful for me, and I hope that you're enjoying it as well, the transcript of the manifesto. But one of the pieces of feedback is that they like hearing more. Some of the listeners like to hear more of my interpretation than the actual source code. So I'll just take that into consideration for future, but I'll definitely finish this one. My blog posts on the Synthesis site often have themes from movies and books, and I actually find that a really, really rewarding way to develop my thinking around some of these concepts. Great authors and great literature, they have a way of getting metaphorical truth across in a very engaging way, and so I'm sure that some of those themes will carry over into the podcast. All right, so let's jump into the macrocosm. So some of the things that I just repeated from the show, I have to admit, was that, for one thing, they said in the TV series, they said there was never any evidence of another member, even though he always referred to FC as a collective, so as a plural. And they said that FC was definitely the signature on the manifesto and some of the threats that were mailed in, but they said that it was always etched in the bombs, but I don't know that for sure. I just got that from the TV show, so I don't know that for sure. In one of the links I shared on episode 1, that was a really excellent documentary, YouTube documentary, but 2 hours long by a German film crew. They really dug into the links with the Unabomber and links to Vietnam and links to MKUltra, and they even went and interviewed some of the bomb victims and asked them what they thought of the manifesto, and without exception, the bomb victims never read the manifesto. They're innocent victims, so don't get me wrong. They're absolutely innocent victims. They don't deserve any of that. But when somebody actually goes to that trouble to bomb you because of work you're doing, I'm really shocked that you don't want to go and look into what the thinking is behind that. But they're able to just say, I don't want to look, I don't want to know, I don't want to give this guy any after what he did. So anyway, in that documentary, there was a point where the filmmakers were in correspondence with Ted Kaczynski in prison. He said that there were mistakes in the published versions on the newspapers, which to me means he thinks they were corrupted. So some of his stronger points were manipulated. And it's very, very difficult to get the original because he said in that recording the originals are handwritten and very hard to read, and there's only a couple of copies of them floating around. So if anyone, I think it would be a fascinating study to see what was manipulated in the published versions, because then you'll know what of his points the authorities were most threatened by. I think that would be really, really enlightening if anyone has any idea how to get their hands on the original. So he's always claimed his innocence. So you've got a guy that everyone believes is the Unabomber. He went to trial. The trial was fixed. That was in the TV show, but it was also in other sources. Where did I read that? Anyway, something quite credible that his defense counsel colluded with the prosecution and the judge, and they had a deal without his knowing ahead of the case. So, I mean, if that's not corruption of due process, that's incredible. He's always claimed his innocence, yet he went and put his name on a book called Anti-Tech Revolution, Why and How. And, that's very close to the themes and writing style of the manifesto. So, to me, there's definitely an admission that he wrote the manifesto, but I don't know how strong the facts are about the bombs. I don't know how strong the linkage is. They kind of alluded that there was like a second cabin where they found some materials that could have been used for bomb making, but I don't know how strong those ties are. So I think, if he hasn't actually been proven guilty in the court of law with the facts, I'd say it's pretty safe to say that he wrote the manifesto. So that probably means that he phoned in threats. So, the circumstantial evidence is really strong. But in terms of actually manufacturing the bombs and actually manning the bombs, I don't know how strong that case is. So I just have to be clear and honest about that. I will continue to include the links on the podcast. Okay, so I think that it's going to be most useful as for the listener if I tell you what I thought some of his strongest points are from the book, so that when we get into the manifesto, you are primed for what 20 years later, what some of his strongest points remained. One is this idea of AI. That's something that Max Spears was absolutely convinced about, that there's an intelligence in our technology that's monitoring and manipulating. I'm not sure about manipulating, but definitely monitoring and influencing, that's probably a better word, our experience at times. So I know that sounds a bit out there, a bit X-Files, but it's worth carrying that lens around with you. Like this, to me, the face recognition, this is what I started to say earlier, the face recognition, those really annoying I'm not a robot CAPTCHA exercises that are unbelievably tricky sometimes. Is this a tree, or does this count as a tree? Does this count as a motorcycle, or does this count as a rider? I don't think it's accidental that some of those CAPTCHA tests are incredibly difficult to decide which ones are in and which ones are out. And I think, if you were an AI and you wanted to learn human strengths and weaknesses and human intelligence, that's a perfect way to go about it. And the face scanning, I consider him a friend. Definitely one of the connections on the website, Ole Demagard. I've met and had dinner with he and his wife once at a conference, and I've got the utmost respect for his work and his integrity. And I know he's done some pieces on the face scanning technology. But what I've got a phone that does that now, and I always feel a little bit like something was taken to me whenever it does the face scan, taken from me. Again, if you're an AI, you could monitor the emotional state of everybody with a face scanner all day long. So what you can easily collect and analyze the emotional state of the population that way. And that's kind of creepy to think about. I think AI is a worthwhile lens to consider and carry around. And this increasingly complex, I mentioned this as well, passwords. Like Amazon, I had a nightmare with Amazon, Gmail. I've got, you've got 10 or 12 of these accounts. You can't possibly keep them in your mind. And anyway, what's the end result of that experience? One is you start to kind of doubt yourself. You kind of feel weak, like these complicated passwords, and they keep changing. So you start to get a bit forgetful about your own passwords and feel like a bit of a loser when you can't log into your own Gmail account, for example, and it's frustrating. I mean, it's really, really frustrating to get locked out of your Amazon account when you're trying to ship yourself something or what have you. I'm willing to continue to test the idea that there's an AI behind some of this that is learning from our limits and learning from our emotions. Okay, I'm just testing that idea. I can't say that I have a really strong conviction on this, but I think it's already out there and it's already evolving. That's my pet opinion on the matter. Okay, one of the strongest points in that film, which was directly inspired by the Unabomber work, was a German. What was he? I think he may have been a mathematician. He's a very, very thoughtful. He could have been either a philosopher or a mathematician or a combination near the end. This, to me, is one of the strongest points in the favor of being nervous about technology, okay? That's what I'm going through here. He pointed out that the words science, schism, scissors, school, I think, even, you get the gist, that it's a split, okay? That science is designed to split the mind and create an outer focus, and that's why it's dangerous. It's a dehumanizing pursuit, and so I think that's worth keeping in mind. As I said in the first episode, I can't imagine. I mean, from our perspective now, imagining somebody prohibiting any further advance in technology, that sounds more tyrannical than the technology, as I mentioned before. So, but I think it's worth looking at. I mean, we can all see some of the negatives from how far we've come on some of this technology, some of the social network culture and cyberbullying and privacy violations, and on it goes, fingerprinting and eye scanning. So if you consider that science is a schism in the mind, then you can see how someone could conclude that you gotta stop at some point, or it's headed directly for total destruction. So I don't know if anyone's heard of the concept of Fermi paradox. This is one I personally don't subscribe to, but it's worth sharing because it is a great point in one respect. And the Fermi paradox is basically the idea that we haven't heard from any other advanced civilizations. No radio waves, nothing. So the thinking is that civilizations that get advanced technologically self-destruct. That's the thinking. And so there's a lesson to be learned there. This mass extinction event, I've got a connection who I feel like we're friends, but we've only connected through direct messaging. But I looked pretty deeply into his work at one point. He's a quantum physicist, Mike Emery. He's one of the top publishers on academia.edu, I believe it is. And he said, just like they said in he makes this case in his book, that there's evidence, and people that have really looked deeply into it believe strongly that there were at least five intelligent advanced civilizations on Earth before us, and they all self-destructed. There's another kind of warning sign that there is something extremely dangerous about blindly advancing down the industrial technological track, and that's what some people are predicting, that if you continue, there's another mass extinction event on the way. To me, the strongest point, and this came through really well in the miniseries on Netflix, I'll give you the car example because that was such a perfect one. Because when we still, to this day, when you think of a car, you think of a brilliant innovation that gives people independent freedom. You can run your own business out of a car. You can be self-sufficient. You could leave your home when you're 16 if you get your own car. I mean, when you're in a bad home situation and you have just a car, you can have a lot of independence. So we all love our cars. And when they came along in the horse and buggy days, it looked like, a small enhancement on a horse and buggy. It's just a motorized. It can go a little further, less maintenance. There's more terrain, less weather concerns, and so on and so on. But his point, the Unabomber's point, is that then soon you're no longer wandering anywhere you want. Now you're wandering on predefined tracks. And the predefined tracks have rules and lights and controls. So now you're much easier to be controlled and monitored. And cities are getting built. All new communities are built for cars. So then it becomes you have to have a car to function. So it's no longer like this step towards freedom. It's now this extra financial burden to enter society, and it's easily controllable, and it's not optional in a lot of ways, in a lot of places. Just like the struggles you probably can imagine when your kids are in their teens about giving them a phone. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You can see that with a lot of technologies. That you don't give them the phone, they're not communicating. They get it socially alienated from the people that are communicating that way. You give them a phone, it's like you've got all kinds of people with access to your kids and all kinds of bad behaviors that go unmonitored on the social networking sites that can be really negative to their psyche. I never looked at a car as anything but positive until that, but I think it's a really original and insightful way to look at technology and consider if we're actually building the walls of our own electronic prison. I don't know who said it that way the first, but I think that's, we're the ones inventing the face scanning technology and the eye scanning technology and the cameras everywhere, and then they're being used to monitor us and control us in a lot of ways. So I think it's a really healthy lens to carry and consider. At what point is it are we working for the technology, not the other way around? I think that's really, really worth considering. Okay, I think some of his weakest points. So the book, I read everything to do with the why, and the appendix is also really great. If you actually get your hands on the book, you could spend maybe 90 minutes or less on the appendices, because on the appendices he's got the strongest points for each of the chapters, and those are great as well in terms of kind of Cole's Notes version. I didn't. There was 2 chapters on rebellions and successful rebellions and how to manage a successful rebellion and so on. And I read one of those, I think. So there's one of those chapters I just didn't feel like I needed to read right now. I guess what I would say some of his weakest points. So there was a letter to the editor that he included in the appendix. A great question. They said, well, capitalism seems like it really leads us towards technical innovation. Capitalism creates a pressure where you want to do everything faster, more repeatable, more automated. And so don't you think the capitalism system is flawed? And I don't think he had a great answer to that. His answer was basically no. Capitalism in and of itself isn't flawed. But I just don't think, even though he's a great mind, I'm not sure he's completely framed the problem. I mean, maybe it's really difficult with the diet he probably has in prison and the conditions he's got. Maybe his mind isn't working like the way it used to be. But I don't think he's framed he's raised the flags. He's raised those flags that I just mentioned. But I'm not 100% sure that he's framed the issue in terms of well, at one point the wheel was technology. So would you say inventing the wheel was, we should have stopped there? Or he hasn't demarked the limits and why, at a certain point, okay, microchip, was the microchip? I mean, that was a step too far. But what he is saying is that he can see that we're heading for self-destruction and we're building the walls of our own prison, and it's time to stop. It's time to stop advancing on that path and let people get back to a more spiritual connection with the earth and with each other. And it's hard to argue with some of that, but it's just more like the how, I think that maybe those are some of the weaker examples that he hasn't framed it. I don't think he's gotten to the bottom of it. He's taken one manifestation of our psychology, I guess you could almost say, and I think there's a few levels underneath that you could get to where you could demark the problem, and you could raise flags when you're getting into a danger zone. Theoretically, that's where I'm at. Okay, well, let's jump over to the maybe read 50 paragraphs or so, and we'll probably wrap up the manifesto in the next episode. All right, so we left off paragraph 93 in the Washington Post version. We are going to argue that industrial technological society cannot be reformed in such a way as to prevent it from progressively narrowing the sphere of human freedom, because freedom is a word that can be interpreted in many ways. First, make clear what kind of freedom we're concerned with. By freedom, we mean the opportunity to go through the power process with real goals, not the artificial goals of surrogate activities, and without interference, manipulation, or supervision from anyone, especially from any large organization. Freedom means being in control, either as an individual or as a member of a small group, of the life and death issues of one's existence: food, clothing, shelter, and defense against whatever threats there may be in one's environment. Freedom means having power, not the power to control other people, but the power to control the circumstances of one's own life. I didn't realize how critical this is. We stopped at a very critical point. One does not have freedom if anyone else, especially a large organization, has power over one, no matter how benevolently, tolerantly, and permissively that power may be exercised. It is important not to confuse freedom with mere permissiveness. This situation reminds me, I mentioned the family farm community that I spent my summers in from childhood right through until my teens, until I was 18. I think I witnessed that community going from true freedom, independent operators, cooperating often with co-opting, supporting one another, but also competing in the marketplace. And slowly over time, large organizations and governments started to control the dynamics of their economy. And over time, the thriving independent family farm operators were squeezed to, much more, they were squeezed so much that they had to get into, they had to change professions, or they had to ramp up the scale dramatically, and then they got into environmental challenges because their farms got so large that you've got environmental concerns then, and you've got to squeeze costs everywhere. And anyway, that's an aside. 95. It is said that we live in a free society because we have a certain number of constitutionally guaranteed rights, but these are not as important as they seem. On 94, I need to make one other point here. Freedom means not having power, not the power to control other people, but the power to control the circumstances of one's own life. One does not have freedom if anyone else, especially a large organization, has power over one, no matter how benevolently, tolerantly, and permissively that power may be exercised. So I just wanted to make this point. Just some of the content I've been listening to this week from Mark Passio, he makes the point strongly that there's certain beliefs we don't have a right to have, and one of them is that slavery is okay for some people. You don't have the right to allow yourself to be enslaved. That's not actually a right that you have. You're transgressing yourself in that case. So if you're permissively allowing yourself to be enslaved, you're transgressing against yourself, your own natural rights. Okay, 95. The degree of personal freedom that exists in a society is determined more by the economic and technological structure of a society than by its laws or its forms of government. Most of the Indian nations of New England were monarchies, and many of the cities of the Italian Renaissance were controlled by dictators. But in reading about these societies, one gets the impression that they allowed far more personal freedom than our society does. In part, this was because they lacked efficient mechanisms for enforcing the ruler's will. There were no modern, well-organized police forces, no rapid long-distance communications, no surveillance cameras, no dossiers of information about the lives of average citizens. Hence, it was relatively easy to evade control. As for our constitutional rights, consider, for example, that freedom of the press. We certainly don't mean to knock that right. It's a very important tool for limiting concentration of political power and for keeping those who do have political power in line by publicly exposing any misbehavior on their part. But freedom of the press is of very little use to the average citizen as an individual. The mass media are mostly under the control of large organizations that are integrated into the system. Anyone who has a little money can have something printed or can distribute it on the internet or in some such way, but what he has to say will be swamped by the vast volume of material put out by the media. Hence, it will have no practical effect. Don't forget, this was published, I think it was around 95, right? So he was probably writing this in the late 80s. To make an impression on society with words is therefore almost impossible for most individuals and small groups. Take us, FC, for example. If we had never done anything violent and had submitted the present writings to a publisher, they probably would not have been accepted. If they had been accepted and published, they probably would not have attracted many readers, because it's more fun to watch the entertainment put out by the media than to read a sober essay. Even if these writings had many readers, most of these readers would soon have forgotten what they had read, as their minds were flooded by the mass material to which the media exposed them. In order to get our message before the public with some chance of making a lasting impression, we've had to kill people. Okay, so there you go. If this was an uncorrupted part, the FC is confessing that so whoever wrote the manifesto is confessing that they killed people. And then Ted Kaczynski later writes a book called Anti-Tech Revolution, Why and How. So there's nothing funny about that, but there's definitely an association, even though he's never admitted guilt. Okay, constitutional rights are useful up to a point, but they do not serve to guarantee much more than what might be called the bourgeois conception of freedom. According to the bourgeois concept, a free man is essentially an element of social machine and has only a certain set of prescribed and delimited freedoms that are designed to serve the needs of the social machine more than those of the individual. Thus, the bourgeois' free man has economic freedom because that promotes growth and progress. He has freedom of the press because public criticism restrains behavior by political leaders. He has a right to a fair trial because imprisonment at the whim of the powerful would be bad for the system. This was clearly the attitude of Simon Bolivar. To him, people deserve liberty only if they use it to promote progress as conceived by the bourgeois. Other bourgeois thinkers have taken a similar view of freedom as a mere means to collective ends. Chester C. Tan, Chinese Political Thought in the 20th Century, page 202, explains the philosophy of Kuomintang leader Hu Hanmin. An individual is granted rights because he is a member of society, and his community life requires such rights. By community, Hu means the whole society of the nation. And on page 259, Tan states that according to Chiang Chun-mai, head of the state, freedom had to be used in the interest of the state and of the people as a whole. But what kind of freedom does one have if one can use it only as someone else prescribes? I mean, just the implication here that there's someone granting rights to someone else, that's just flawed right there. FC's conception of freedom is not that of Bolivar, Hu, Chang, or other bourgeois theorists. The trouble with such theorists is that they have made the development and application of social theories their surrogate activity. Consequently, the theories are designed to serve the needs of the theorists more than the needs of the people who may be unlucky enough to live in a society on which their theories are imposed. 98. One more point to be made in this section. It should not be assumed that a person has enough freedom just because he says he has enough. Freedom is restricted in part by psychological controls, also referred to as mind control, of which people are unconscious, And moreover, many people's ideas of what constitutes freedom are governed more by social convention than by their real needs. For example, it's likely that many leftists of the over-socialized type would say that most people, including themselves, are socialized too little rather than too much. Yet the over-socialized leftist pays a heavy psychological price for his high level of socialization. I think domestication is another word, and I think over-feminized. I'm sorry to say, but I think that's what over-socialized means. It means, and that can be men and women, it can mean just the healthy masculine energy is sucked out of the society. Some principles of history. Think of history as being the sum of two components, an erratic component that exists of unpredictable events that follow no discernible pattern, and a regular component that consists of long-term historical trends. Here we're concerned with the long-term trends. First principle. If a small change is made that affects a long-term historical trend, then the effect of that change will almost always be transitory. The trend will soon revert to its original state. For example, a reform movement designed to clean up political corruption in a society rarely has more than a short-term effect. Sooner or later, the reformers relax and corruption creeps back in. The level of political corruption in a given society tends to remain constant or to change only slowly with the evolution of the society. Normally, a political cleanup will be permanent only if accompanied by a widespread social change. A small change in the society won't be enough. If a small change in a long-term historical trend appears to be permanent, it is only because the change acts in the direction in which the trend is already moving, so that the trend is not altered by only a pushed, so that the trend is not altered, but only pushed a step ahead. The first principle is almost a tautology, which is a redundancy. If a trend were not stable with respect to small changes, it would wander at random rather than follow a definite direction. In other words, it would not be a long-term trend at all. Second principle, if a change is made that is sufficiently large to alter permanently a long-term historical trend, then it will alter the society as a whole. In other words, the society is a system in which all parts are interrelated, and you can't permanently change any important part without changing all other parts as well. Third principle, if a change is made that is large enough to alter permanently a long-term trend, then the consequences for society as a whole cannot be predicted in advance. Unless various other societies have passed through the same change and have all experienced the same consequences, in which case one can predict on empirical grounds that another society that passes through the same change will be likely to experience similar consequences. So that point, let me just say the first sentence again. If a change is made that's large enough to alter permanently a long-term trend, then the consequences for the society as a whole cannot be predicted in advance, okay, unless you have an empirical history there. Okay, fourth principle, a new kind of society cannot be designed on paper. That is, you can't plan out a new form of society in advance, then set it up and expect it to function as it was designed to. The third and fourth principles result from the complexity of human societies. A change in human behavior will affect the economy of a society and its physical environment. The economy will affect the environment and vice versa. And the changes in the economy and the environment will affect human behavior in complex, unpredictable ways, and so forth. The network of causes and effects is far too complex to be untangled and understood. Fifth principle, people do not consciously and rationally choose the form of their society. Societies develop through processes of social evolution that are not under human control. The fifth principle is a consequence of the other four. To illustrate, by the first principle, generally speaking, an attempt at social reform either acts in the direction of the society is developing anyway, so it merely accelerates a change that was coming anyway, or it only has a transitory effect, so the society soon slips back to its old groove, muscle memory, in my words. To make a lasting change in the direction of development of any important aspect of a society,
Reform is insufficient and revolution is required. A revolution does not necessarily involve an armed uprising or the overthrow of a government. By the second principle, a revolution never changes only one aspect of a society, it changes the whole society. And by the third principle, changes occur that were never expected or desired by the revolutionary, unintended consequences. So by the fourth principle, when revolutionaries or utopians set up a new kind of society, it never works out as planned. The American Revolution does not provide a counterexample. The American Revolution was not a revolution in our sense of the word, but a war of independence followed by a rather far-reaching political reform. The Founding Fathers did not change the direction of development of American society, nor did they aspire to do so. They only freed the development of the American society from the retarding effect of British rule. Their political reform did not change any basic trend, but only pushed American political culture along its natural direction of development. British society, of which American society was an offshoot, had been moving for a long time in the direction of representative democracy, and prior to the War of Independence, the Americans were already practicing a significant degree of representative democracy in the colonial assemblies. The political system established by the Constitution was modeled on the British system and on the colonial assemblies. With major alteration, to be sure, there is no doubt that the Founding Fathers took a very important step, but it was a step along the road that English-speaking world was already traveling. The proof is that Britain and all of its colonies that were populated predominantly by people of British descent ended up with systems of representative democracy essentially similar to that of the U.S. If the Founding Fathers had lost their nerve and declined to sign the Declaration of Independence, our way of life today would not have been significantly different. I've not studied this history that much, but I think he's stretching it here a little bit, but that's okay. It's his manifesto. Maybe we would have had somewhat closer ties to Britain and would have had Parliament and Prime Minister instead of a Congress and President. No big deal. Thus, the American Revolution provides not a counterexample to our principles, but a good illustration of them. Still, one has to use common sense in applying the principles. They are expressed in imprecise language that allows latitude for interpretation, and exceptions to them can be found. So we present these principles not as inviolable laws, but as rules of thumb or guides to thinking that may provide a partial antidote to naive ideas about the futures of society. The principles should be borne constantly in mind, and whenever one reaches a conclusion that conflicts with them, one should be careful about re-examining one's thinking and retain the conclusion only if one has good solid reasons for doing so. Okay, this is a point that Jordan Peterson makes frequently. Social reforms and unintended consequences are always intertwined. Okay, 111. The foregoing principles help to show how hopelessly difficult it would be to reform the industrial system in such a way as to prevent it from progressively narrowing our sphere of freedom. This is kind of amazing. I mean, he's just saying that we're on one track, the industrial technological track, and and as long as we choose that that's our track, it's going to continue to narrow our freedom. There has been a consistent tendency going back at least to the Industrial Revolution for the technology to strengthen the system at a high cost in individual freedom and local autonomy. Hence, any change designed to protect freedom from technology would be contrary to a fundamental trend in the development of society. Consequently, such a change either would be a transitory one, soon swamped by the tide of history, or if large enough to be permanent, would alter the nature of our whole society. This by the first and second principles, period. Moreover, since society would be altered in a way that could not be predicted in advance, third principle, there would be great risk. Changes large enough to make a lasting difference in favor of freedom would not be initiated because it would be realized that they would gravely disrupt the system. So, any attempts at reform would be too timid
to be effective. Okay, this is his case for revolution. Even if changes large enough to make a lasting difference were initiated, they would be retracted when their disruptive effects became apparent. Thus, permanent changes in favor of freedom could be brought about only by persons prepared to accept radical, dangerous, and unpredictable alteration of the entire system. In other words, revolutionaries, not reformers. People anxious to rescue freedom without sacrificing the supposed benefits of technology will suggest naive schemes for some new form of society that would reconcile freedom with technology. Apart from the fact that people who make such suggestions seldom propose any practical means by which the new form of society could be set up in the first place, it follows from the fourth principle that even if the new form of society could be once established, it either would collapse or would give results very different from those expected. So, even on very general grounds, it seems highly improbable that any way of changing society could be found that would reconcile freedom with modern technology. In the next few sections, we will give more specific reasons for concluding that freedom and technological progress are incompatible. Just as a incidental aside episode on this, but Mark Passio would say that freedom and government are incompatible, not that the technological side of things is a small piece of the puzzle. I've not heard him talk about technology as it relates to freedom at all. He's a technologist, actually, but he believes that many of the problems that Ted Kaczynski is pointing to here are caused by the government system, not the technological industrial system. That's an aside for a future discussion. Okay, next section. Restriction of freedom is unavoidable in industrial society. As explained in paragraphs 65, 67, and 70 to 73, modern man is strapped down by a network of rules and regulations, and his fate depends on the actions of persons remote from him whose decision he cannot influence. This is not accidental or a result of the arbitrariness of arrogant bureaucrats. It's necessary and inevitable in any technologically advanced society. The system has to regulate human behavior closely in order to function. At work, people have to do what they are told to do, otherwise production would be thrown into chaos. Bureaucracies have to be run according to rigid rules. To allow any substantial personal discretion to lower-level bureaucrats would disrupt the system and lead to charges of unfairness due to differences in the way the individual bureaucrats exercise their discretion. It is true that some restrictions on our freedom could be eliminated, but generally speaking, the regulation of our lives by large organizations is necessary for the functioning of the industrial technological society. The result is a sense of powerlessness on the part of the average person. It may be, however, that formal regulations will tend increasingly to be replaced by psychological tools that make us want to do what the system requires of us, also known as mind control. And there's a footnote there. Okay, 115. The system has to force people to behave in ways that are increasingly remote from the natural pattern of human behavior. For example, the system needs scientists, mathematicians, and engineers. It can't function without them. So heavy pressure is put on children to excel in these fields. It isn't natural for an adolescent human being to spend the bulk of his time sitting at a desk, absorbed in study. A normal adolescent wants to spend his time in active contact with the real world. Among primitive peoples, the things that children are trained to do tend to be in reasonable harmony with natural human impulses. Among the American Indians, for example, boys were trained in active outdoor pursuits, just the sort of things that boys like. But in our society, children are pushed into studying technical subjects, which most do grudgingly. This gives you this could give you some skepticism about the big push for women in STEM right now. I mean, it's under the guise of equity, but maybe there are other motives. There's a commercial or an ad on Emirates Airlines where they list all these great technical innovations of our time. And then it says the point of the ad is we have to do more. We have to invent more. So it's like it's promoting people to get more technological. I mean, where's that ad coming from, and what's the motive behind that? Okay, so 116. Because of the constant pressure that the system exerts to modify human behavior, there is a gradual increase in the number of people who cannot or will not adjust to society's requirements. Welfare leeches, youth gang members, cultists, anti-government rebels, radical environmentalists, saboteurs, dropouts, and resistors of various kinds. In any technologically advanced society, the individual's fate must depend on decisions that he personally cannot influence to any great extent. A technological society cannot be broken down into small autonomous communities because production depends on the cooperation of very large numbers of people and machines. Such a society must be highly organized, and decisions have to be made that affect very large numbers of people. When a decision affects, say, 1 million people, then each of the affected individuals has on average only 1/1,000,000th share in making the decision. What usually happens in practice is that decisions are made by public officials or corporate executives or by technical specialists. But even when the public votes on a decision, the number of voters ordinarily is too large for the vote of any one individual to be significant. Thus, most individuals are unable to influence measurably the major decisions that affect their lives. There is no conceivable way to remedy this in a technologically advanced society. The system tries to solve this problem by using propaganda to make people want the decisions that have been made for them. But even this solution, quote unquote, were completely successful in making people feel better, it would be demeaning. One other little aside, I read a small book once. It was called something like Initial Conditions. I can't quite remember, but let's say it was Initial Conditions. It was written by, I think it was a woman software engineer. She was talking about, this is just something subtle, but he just mentioned that there are technical specialists that can affect massive aspects of your life, and you don't even think of it. But think of the people. You've got sometimes very low-level software engineers deciding what the default settings are of your next iPhone, for example. And that completely affects, most people don't change all the settings as soon as they get their phone. Most of them go with most of the preset default settings. So you've got fairly low-level software engineers in these major corporations that are really shaping the behavior of a large percentage of the culture. Okay, 118. Conservatives and some others advocate more local autonomy. Local communities once did have autonomy, but such autonomy becomes less and less possible as local communities become more enmeshed with and dependent on large-scale systems like public utilities, computer networks, highway systems, the mass communications media, the modern healthcare system. Also operating against autonomy is the fact that technology applied in one location often affects people at other locations far away. Thus, pesticide or chemical use near a creek may contaminate the water supply hundreds of miles downstream, and the greenhouse gas affects the whole world. Another example is what side of the road you're driving your car on. Are you on the U.S. standard or the UK standard? And you've got some small countries in Southeast Asia who have chosen to go on opposite standards, and the trouble that causes with the supply of the vehicles and crossing the border with vehicles is a nightmare. So it just shows you that the larger the system, the more dependent it is on standards that affect everyone. The system does not and cannot exist to satisfy human needs. Instead, it is human behavior that has to be modified to fit the needs of the system. This has nothing to do with political or social ideology that may pretend to guide the technological system. It is the fault of the technology because the system is guided not by ideology, but by technical necessity. The system does satisfy many human needs, but generally speaking, it does this only to the extent that it is to the advantage of the system to do it. It is the needs of the system that are paramount, not those of the human being. For example, the system provides people with food because the system couldn't function if everyone starved. It attends to people's psychological needs whenever it can conveniently do so, because it couldn't function if too many people became depressed or rebellious. But the system, for good, solid, practical reasons, must exert constant pressure on people to mold their behavior to the need of the system. Too much waste accumulating? The government, the media, the educational system, environmentalists, everyone inundates us with a massive propaganda about recycling. Need more technical personnel? A chorus of voices exhorts kids to study science. No one stops to ask whether it is inhuman to force adolescents to spend the bulk of their time studying subjects most of them hate. When skilled workers are put out of a job by technical advances and have to undergo retraining, no one asks whether it's humiliating for them to be pushed around in this way. This reminds me of the Learn to Code controversy from last year. I can't remember what the industry was. It was an older, more traditional industry like steel workers or miners that were getting laid off, and some reporters, or maybe it was only one reporter, wrote an article called Learn to Code. Then like 10 years later, when journalists were getting laid off, Learn to Code became a meme, and it was a very sensitive topic on social media for whatever reason. It was like flagged as hate speech and things. Okay, it is simply taken for granted that everyone must bow to technical necessity, and for good reason. If human needs were put before technical necessity, there would be economic problems, unemployment, shortages, or worse. The concept of mental health in our society is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the needs of the system and does so without showing signs of stress. I think that's a really, really good point. The concept of mental health is defined largely by the extent to which an individual behaves in accord with the system and does so without showing signs of stress. Efforts to make room for a sense of purpose and for autonomy within the system are no better than a joke. For example, one company, instead of having each of its employees assemble only one section of a catalog, had each assemble a whole catalog, and this was supposed to give them a sense of purpose and achievement. Some companies have tried to give their employees more autonomy in their work, but for practical reasons this usually can be done only to a very limited extent, and in any case, employees are never given autonomy as to the ultimate goals of their autonomous efforts can never be directed towards goals that they select personally, but only towards their employer's goals, such as the survival and growth of the company. Any company would soon go out of business if it permitted its employees to act otherwise. Similarly, in any enterprise within a socialist system, workers must direct their efforts towards the goals of the enterprise. Otherwise, the enterprise will not serve its purpose as part of the system. Once again, for purely technical reasons, it is not possible for most individuals or small groups to have much autonomy in an industrial society. Even the small business owner commonly has only limited autonomy. Apart from the necessity of government regulation, he is restricted by the fact that he must fit into the economic system and conform to its requirements. For instance, when someone develops a new technology, the small business person often has to use that technology whether he wants to or not in order to remain competitive. The bad parts of technology cannot be separated from the good parts. 121. A further reason why industrial society cannot be reformed in favor of freedom is that modern technology is a unified system in which all parts are dependent on one another. You can't get rid of the bad parts of technology and retain only the good parts. Take modern medicine, for example. Progress in medical science depends on progress in chemistry, physics, biology, computer science, and other fields. Advanced medical treatments require expensive high-tech equipment that can be made available only by a technologically progressive, economically rich society. Clearly, you can't have much progress in medicine without the whole technological system and everything that goes with it. I think I should just have a tiny little aside here because I forgot to mention. Another point that I took from the TV series was that the targets he picked were completely at random. That was stated a few different times, but that's the only source I know that from. I've never heard of anyone analyzing the reason he picked the targets he picked, but there could easily have been a very specific reason for some of the technologies and the system that he targeted. 122. Even if medical progress could be maintained without the rest of the technological system, it would by itself bring certain evils. Suppose, for example, that a cure for diabetes is discovered. People with a genetic tendency to diabetes will then be able to survive and reproduce as well as anyone else. Natural selection against genes for diabetes will cease, and such genes will spread throughout the population. This may be occurring to some extent already, since diabetes, while not curable, can be controlled through the use of insulin. The same thing will happen with many other diseases, susceptibility to which is affected by the genetic degradation of the population. The only solution will be some sort of eugenics program or extensive genetic engineering of human beings, so that man in the future will no longer be a creation of nature or of chance or of God, depending on your religious or philosophical opinions, but a manufactured product. Okay, this is a major topic in Mark Passio's world. I'm sure we'll come back to it. He has coined the term epi-eugenics, meaning population control through controlling the culture, essentially. 123. If you think that big government interferes in your life too much now, just wait till the government starts regulating the genetic constitution of your children. Such regulation will inevitably follow the introduction of genetic engineering of human beings, because the consequences of unregulated genetic engineering would be disastrous. So 1 point, reproductive rate of your nation is below 2.1, then your population is shrinking. And there are some countries in Asia, I think Japan, I think it's down below 1. So it's down somewhere around 0.9. So there are a number of populations that are below 2.1. I think most of the Western world is currently. So that's just an example of how the culture is affecting the genes being passed on. 124. The usual response to such concerns is to talk about medical ethics, quote unquote. But a code of ethics would not serve to protect freedom in the face of medical progress. It would only make matters worse. A code of ethics applicable to genetic engineering would be, in effect, a means of regulating the genetic constitution of human beings. Somebody, probably the upper middle class mostly, would decide that such and such applications of genetic engineering were quote-unquote ethical and others were not, so that in effect they would be imposing their own values on the genetic constitution of the population at large. Even if a code of ethics were chosen on a completely democratic basis, the majority would be imposing their own values on any minorities who might have a different idea of what constituted an ethical use of genetic engineering. The only code of ethics that would be truly protect freedom would be one that prohibited any genetic engineering of human beings, and you can be sure that no such code will ever be applied in a technological society. No code reduced genetic engineering to a minor role could stand up for long, because the temptation presented by the immense power of biotechnology would be irresistible, especially since to the majority of people, many of its applications will seem obviously and unequivocally good. For example, eliminating physical and mental diseases, giving people the abilities they need to get along in today's world. Inevitably, genetic engineering will be used extensively, but only in ways consistent with the needs of the industrial technological system. Technology is a more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. This is really a little bit synchronistic. Mark Passio recently had a podcast. I can't remember exactly, or let's say it's around 220. The evil is a stronger force than good. And I think that's sort of what's being said here. Technology is a more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. He wasn't saying that's how it should be, but it's just the way it's playing out in society at the moment. 125, it's not possible to make a lasting compromise between technology and freedom because technology is by far the more powerful social force and continually encroaches on freedom through repeated compromises. Imagine the case of two neighbors, each of whom at the outset owns the same amount of land, but one is more powerful than the other. The powerful one demands a piece of the other's land. The weak one refuses. The powerful one says, okay, let's compromise. Give me half of what I asked. The weak one has little choice, gives in. Sometime later, the powerful neighbor demands another piece. Again, there's a compromise and so forth. By forcing a long series of compromises on the weaker man, the powerful one eventually gets all of his land. So it goes on the conflict between technology and freedom. Let us explain why technology is a more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. A technological advance that appears not to threaten freedom often turns out to threaten it very seriously later. For example, consider motorized transport. A walking man formerly could go where he pleased, go at his own pace, without observing traffic regulations, and was independent of technological support systems. When motor vehicles were introduced, they appeared to increase man's freedom. They took no freedom away from the walking man. No one had to have an automobile if he didn't want one. And anyone who did choose to buy an automobile could travel much faster and farther than a walking man. But the introduction of motorized transport soon changed society in such a way as to restrict greatly man's freedom of locomotion. When automobiles became numerous, it became necessary to regulate their use extensively. In a car, especially in densely populated areas, one cannot just go where one likes at one's own pace. One's movement is governed by the flow of traffic and by various traffic laws. One is tied down by various obligations, license requirements, driver's tests, renewing registration, insurance, maintenance required for safety, monthly payments on purchase price. Moreover, the use of a motorized transport is no longer optional. Since the introduction of motorized transport, the arrangement of our cities has changed in such a way that the majority of people no longer live within walking distance of their place of employment, shopping areas, and recreational opportunities. So they have to depend on the automobile for transport, or else they must use public transport, in which case they have even less control over their own movement than when driving a car. Even the walker's freedom is now greatly restricted. In the city, he continually has to stop to wait for traffic lights that are designed mainly to serve auto traffic. In the country, motor traffic makes it dangerous and unpleasant to walk along the highway. Note, this is an important point that we have just illustrated with the case of motorized transport. When a new item of technology is introduced as an option that an individual can accept or not as he chooses, it does not necessarily remain optional. In many cases, the new technology changes society in such a way that people eventually find themselves forced to use it. Facebook is probably a good example there. While technological progress as a whole continually narrows our sphere of freedom, each new technical advance considered by itself appears to be desirable. Electricity, indoor plumbing, rapid long-distance communications. How could one argue against any of these things or against any of the innumerable technical advances that have made modern society? It would have been absurd to resist the introduction of the telephone, for example. It offered many advantages and no disadvantages, yet, as we explained in paragraphs 59 to 76, all these technical advances taken together have created a world in which the average man's fate is no longer in his own hands or in the hands of his neighbors and friends, but in those of politicians, corporate executives, and remote anonymous technicians and bureaucrats whom he, as an individual, has no power to influence. The same process will continue in the future. Take genetic engineering, for example. Few people will resist the introduction of a genetic technique that eliminates a hereditary disease. It does no apparent harm and prevents much suffering, yet a large number of genetic improvements taken together will make the human being into an engineered product rather than a creation of chance or of God or whatever, depending on your religious beliefs. 129. Another reason why technology is such a powerful social force is that within the context of a given society, technological progress marches on in only one direction. It can never be reversed. Once a technical innovation has been introduced, people usually become dependent on it, so they can never again do without it unless it is replaced by some still more advanced innovation. Not only do people become dependent as individuals on a new item of technology, but even more, the system as a whole becomes dependent on it. Imagine what would happen to the system today if computers, for example, were eliminated. The other day at work, my PC died near the end of the day. I had some time to contemplate what people used to do without PCs at the office. Everything is done with your PC now. Thus, the system can move in only one direction, toward technologization. Technology repeatedly forces freedom to take a step back, but technology can never take a step back, short of the overthrow of the whole system. Technology advances with great rapidity and threatens freedom at many different points at the same time. Crowding, rules and regulations, increasing dependence of individuals on large organizations, propaganda and other psychological techniques, genetic engineering, invasion of privacy through surveillance devices and computers, etc. To hold back any one of the threats to freedom would require a long and difficult social struggle. Those who want to protect freedom are overwhelmed by the sheer number of new attacks, and the rapidity with which they develop. Hence, they become apathetic and no longer resist. To fight each of the threats separately would be futile. Success can be hoped for only by fighting the technological system as a whole, but that is revolution, not reform. 131. Technicians. We use this term in its broad sense to describe all those who perform a specialized task that requires training. Technicians tend to be so involved in their work, which is their surrogate activity, that when a conflict arises between their technical work and freedom, they almost always decide in favor of their technical work. This is obvious in the case of scientists, but it also appears elsewhere. Educators, humanitarian groups, conservation organizations do not hesitate to use propaganda or other technological techniques to help them achieve their laudable ends. Corporations and government agencies, when they find it useful, do not hesitate to collect information about individuals without regard to their privacy. Law enforcement agencies are frequently inconvenienced by the constitutional rights of suspects and often of completely innocent persons, and they do whatever they can do legally or sometimes illegally to restrict or circumvent those rights. Most of these educators, government officials, and law officers believe in freedom, privacy, and constitutional rights, but when these conflict with their work, they usually feel that their work is more important. It is well known that people generally work better and more persistently when striving for a reward than when attempting to avoid a punishment or negative outcome. Scientists and other technicians are motivated mainly by the rewards they get through their work, but those who oppose technological invasions of freedom are working to avoid a negative outcome. Consequently, there are few who work persistently and well at this discouraging task. I'll just read that once again. But those who oppose technological invasions of freedom are working to avoid a negative outcome. Consequently, there are few who work persistently and well at this discouraging task. If reformers ever achieved a single victory that seemed to set up a solid barrier against further erosion of freedom through technical progress, most would tend to relax and turn their attention to more agreeable pursuits, but the scientists would remain busy in their laboratories, and technology, as it progresses, would find ways, in spite of any barriers, to exert more and more control over individuals and make them always more dependent on the system. No social arrangements, whether laws, institutions, customs, or ethical codes, can provide permanent protection against technology. History shows that all social arrangements are transitory. They all change or break down eventually, but technological advances are permanent within the context of a given civilization. Suppose, for example, that it were possible to arrive at some social arrangements that would prevent genetic engineering from being applied to human beings, or prevent it from being applied in such a way as to threaten freedom and dignity. Still, the technology would remain waiting. Sooner or later, the social arrangement would break down, probably sooner, given the pace of change in our society. Then genetic engineering would begin to invade our sphere of freedom, and this invasion would be irreversible, short of a breakdown of technological civilization itself. Any illusions about achieving anything permanent through social arrangements should be dispelled by what is currently happening with environmental legislation. A few years ago, it seemed that there were secure legal barriers preventing at least some of the worst forms of environmental degradation. A change in political wind, and those barriers begin to crumble. For all the foregoing reasons, technology is a more powerful social force than the aspiration for freedom. But this statement requires an important qualification. It appears that during the next several decades, the industrial technological system will be undergoing severe stresses due to economic and environmental problems, and especially due to problems of human behavior, alienation, rebellion, hostility, and a variety of social and psychological difficulties. We hope that the stresses through which the system is likely to pass will cause it to break down, or at least will weaken it sufficiently so that a revolution against it becomes possible. If such a revolution occurs and is successful, then at that particular moment, the aspiration for freedom will have proved more powerful than technology. In paragraph 125, we use an analogy of a weak neighbor who is left destitute by a strong neighbor, who takes all his land by forcing on him a series of compromises. But suppose now that the strong neighbor gets sick so that he's unable to defend himself. The weak neighbor can force the strong one to give him his land back, or he can kill him. If he lets the strong man survive and only forces him to give the land back, he's a fool, because when the strong man gets well, he will take all the land for himself. The only sensible alternative for the weaker man is to kill the strong one while he still has the chance. He's using this as an analogy for killing the technological system. I'm sure that's clear, but I just making sure everyone knows. In the same way, while the industrial system is sick, we must destroy it. If we compromise with it and let it recover from its sickness, it will eventually wipe out all of our freedom. I think I will read to the next end of this section, and then we'll finish in the next episode. Simpler social problems have proved intractable. If anyone still imagines that it would be possible to reform the system in such a way as to protect freedom from technology, let him consider how clumsily and for the most part unsuccessfully our society has dealt with other social problems that are far more simple and straightforward. Among other things, the system has failed to stop environmental degradation, political corruption, and drug trafficking or domestic abuse. Take our environmental problems, for example. Here, the conflict of values is straightforward. Economic expedience now versus saving some of our natural resources for our grandchildren. But on this subject, we get only a lot of blather and obfuscation from the people who have power and nothing like a clear, consistent line of action. And we keep on piling up environmental problems that our grandchildren will have to live with. Attempts to resolve the environmental issue consist of struggles and compromises between different factions, some of which are ascendant at one moment and others at another moment. The line of struggle changes with the shifting currents of public opinion. This is not a rational process, nor is it one that is likely to lead to a timely and successful solution to the problem. Major social problems, if they get solved at all, are rarely or never solved through any rational, comprehensive plan. They just work themselves out through a process in which various competing groups, pursuing their own, usually short-term self-interest, arrive, mainly by luck, at some more or less stable modus vivendi. In fact, the principles we formulated in paragraph 100 to 106 make it seem doubtful that rational, long-term social planning can ever be successful. Thus, it is clear that the human race has at best a very limited capacity for solving even relatively straightforward social problems. How then is it going to solve the far more difficult and subtle problem of reconciling freedom with technology? Technology presents a clear-cut material advantages, whereas freedom is an abstraction that means different things to different people, and its loss is easily obscured by propaganda and fancy talk. And note this important difference. It is conceivable that our environmental problems, for example, may someday be settled through a rational, comprehensive plan. But if this happens, it will only be because it is in the long-term interest of the system to solve these problems, but it is not in the interest of the system to preserve freedom or small group autonomy. On the contrary, it is in the interest of the system to bring human behavior under control to the greatest possible extent. Thus, while practical considerations may eventually force the system to take a rational, prudent approach to environmental problems, equally practical considerations will force the system to regulate human behavior ever more closely, preferably by direct means that will disguise the encroachment on freedom. This isn't just our opinion. Eminent social scientists, e.g. James Q. Wilson, have stressed the importance of socializing people more effectively. Socializing in quotes. Revolution is easier than reform. 140. We hope we have convinced the reader that the system cannot be reformed in such a way as to reconcile freedom with technology. The only way out is to dispense with the industrial technological system altogether. This implies revolution, not necessarily an armed uprising, but certainly a radical and fundamental change in the nature of society. People tend to assume that because a revolution involves a much greater change than reform does, it is more difficult to bring about than reform is. Actually, under certain circumstances, revolution is much easier than reform. The reason is that a revolutionary movement can inspire an intensity of commitment that a reform movement cannot inspire. A reform movement merely offers to solve a particular social problem. A revolutionary movement offers to solve all problems at one stroke and create a whole new world. It provides the kind of ideal for which people will take great risks and make great sacrifices. For this reason, it would be much easier to overthrow the whole technological system than to put effective, permanent restraints on the development or application of any one segment of technology, such as genetic engineering, for example. Not many people will devote themselves with single-minded passion to imposing and maintaining restraints on genetic engineering. But under suitable conditions, large numbers of people may devote themselves passionately to revolution against the industrial technological system. As we noted in paragraph 132, reformers seeking to limit certain aspects of technology will be working to avoid a negative outcome, but revolutionaries working to gain a powerful reward fulfillment in their revolutionary vision and therefore work harder and more persistently than reformers do. Reform is always restrained by the fear of painful consequences if changes go too far. But once a revolutionary fever has taken hold of society, people are willing to undergo limited hardships for the sake of their revolution. This was clearly shown in the French and Russian revolutions. It may be that in such cases, only a minority of the population is really committed to the revolution, but this minority is sufficiently large and active so that it becomes the dominant force in society. We'll have more to say on this in 180 to 205. Control of human behavior, 143. Since the beginning of civilization, organized societies have had to put pressures on human beings of the sake of the functioning of the social organism. I think that should be for the sake of the function. The kinds of pressures vary greatly from one society to another. Some of the pressures are physical, poor diet, excessive labor. Let's start over. Since the beginning of civilization, organized societies have had to put pressures on human beings for the sake of the functioning of social organism. Okay. The kinds of pressures vary greatly from one society to another. Some pressures are physical, poor diet, excessive labor, environmental pollution. Some are psychological, noise, crowding, forcing human behavior into the mold that society requires. In the past, human nature has been approximately constant, or at any rate has varied only within certain bounds. Consequently, societies have been able to push people only up to certain limits. When the limit of human endurance has been passed, things start to go wrong. Rebellion or crime or corruption or evasion of work or depression and other mental problems or an elevated death rate or a declining birth rate or something else. So that either the society breaks down or its functioning becomes too inefficient.
and it is, quickly or gradually, through a conquest, attrition, or evolution, replaced by some more efficient form of society. Thus, human nature has in the past put certain limits on the development of societies. People could be pushed only so far and no farther. But today, this may be changing because modern technology is developing ways of modifying human beings. Imagine a society that subjects people to conditions that make them terribly unhappy, then gives them drugs to take away their unhappiness. Science fiction? It is already happening to some extent in our society. It is well known that the rate of clinical depression has been greatly increasing in recent decades. We believe that this is due to the disruption of the power process as explained in 59 to 76. But even if we're wrong, the increasing rate of depression is certainly the result of some conditions that exist in today's society. Instead of removing the conditions that make people depressed, modern society gives them antidepressant drugs. In effect, antidepressants are a means of modifying individual's internal state in such a way as to enable him to tolerate social conditions that he would otherwise find intolerable. Yes, we know that depression is often purely genetic origin. We are referring here to those cases in which environment plays the predominant role. 146. Drugs that affect the mind are only one example of the new methods of controlling human behavior that modern society is developing. Let us look at some of the other methods. To start with, there are the techniques of surveillance. Hidden video cameras are now used in most stores and in many other places. Computers are used to collect and process vast amounts of information about individuals. Information so obtained greatly increases the effectiveness of physical coercion, i.e., law enforcement. Then there are the methods of propaganda, for which the mass communication media provide effective vehicles. Efficient techniques have been developed for winning elections, selling products, influencing the public opinion. The entertainment industry serves an important psychological tool for the system, possibly even when it is dishing out large amounts of sex and violence. Entertainment provides modern man with an essential means of escape. While absorbed in television, videos, etc., he can forget stress, anxiety, frustration, dissatisfaction. Many primitive peoples, when they don't have work to do, are quite content to sit for hours at a time doing nothing at all because they're at peace with themselves and the world. But most modern people must be constantly occupied or entertained, otherwise they get quote-unquote bored. They get fidgety, uneasy, irritable. These major blockbuster franchise, everybody's seeing the same movies because there's 2 or 3 major franchises that come out with new versions every year and a half, and everyone goes and sees them. So, I mean, what an unbelievable influence on the culture. Anyway, 148. Other techniques strike deeper than the foregoing. Education is no longer a simple affair of paddling a kid's behind when he doesn't know his lessons and patting him on the head when he does. It is becoming a scientific technique for controlling the child's development. Sylvain learning centers, for example, have had great success in motivating children to study, and psychological techniques are also being used with more or less success in many conventional schools. Parenting techniques that are taught to parents are designed to make children accept fundamental values of the system and behave in ways the system finds desirable. Mental health programs, intervention techniques, psychotherapy, and so forth are ostensibly designed to benefit individuals, but in practice they usually serve as methods for inducing individuals to think and behave as the system requires. There is no contradiction here. An individual whose attitudes or behavior bring him into conflict with the system is up against a force that is too powerful for him to conquer or escape from. Hence, he's likely to suffer from stress, frustration, and defeat. His path will be much easier if he thinks and behaves as the system requires. In that sense, the system is acting for the benefit of the individual when it brainwashes him into conformity. Child abuse in its gross and obvious forms is disapproved of in most, if not all, cultures. Tormenting a child for trivial reason or no reason at all is something that appalls almost everyone. But many psychologists interpret the concept of abuse much more broadly. Is spanking, when used as part of a rational and consistent system of discipline, a form of abuse? The question will ultimately be decided by whether or not the spanking tends to produce behavior that makes a person fit in well with the existing system of society. In practice, the word abuse tends to be interpreted to include any method of child rearing that produces behavior inconvenient for the system. Thus, when they go beyond the prevention of obvious senseless cruelty, programs for preventing child abuse are directed towards the control of human behavior on behalf of the system. Presumably, research will continue to increase the effectiveness of psychological techniques for controlling human behavior, but we think it's unlikely that psychological techniques alone will be sufficient to adjust human beings to the kind of society that technology is creating. Biological methods probably will have to be used. We have already mentioned the use of drugs in this connection. Neurology may provide other avenues for modifying the human mind. Genetic engineering of human beings is already beginning to occur in the form of quote-unquote gene therapy, and there's no reason to assume that such methods will not eventually be used to modify those aspects of the body that affect mental functioning. There's a family of pharmaceuticals that is designed to just make your mind function more in a concentrated fashion for long periods of time. So university students can take these pills. They're fairly natural, actually. They're not pharmaceuticals. They're originally designed as an antidote to ADD to help kids focus. Then fighter pilots discovered them for long missions. Then college students discovered them. They could concentrate on studies for hours at a time when they're cramming. It's an N, I'll remember. As we mentioned in paragraph 134, industrial society seems likely to be entertaining a period of severe stress, due in part to problems of human behavior and in part to economic and environmental problems. And a considerable portion of the system's economic and environmental problems result from the way human beings behave. Alienation, low self-esteem, depression, hostility, rebellion, children who won't study, youth gangs, illegal drug use, rape, child abuse, other crimes, unsafe sex, teen pregnancy, population growth, political corruption, race, hatred, ethnic rivalry, bitter ideological conflict, for example, pro-choice versus pro-life, political extremism, terrorism, sabotage, anti-government groups, hate groups, all these threaten the very survival of the system. The system will therefore be forced to use every practical means of controlling human behavior. The social disruption that we see today is certainly not the result of mere chance. It can only be a result of the conditions of life that the system imposes on people. We have argued that the most important of these conditions is disruption of the power process. If the systems succeed in imposing sufficient control over human behavior to assure its own survival, a new watershed in human history will have been passed. If the system succeeds in imposing sufficient control over human behavior to assure its own survival, a new watershed in human history will have been passed. Whereas formerly the limits of human endurance have imposed limits on the development of societies, as we explain in paragraphs 143 and 144, industrial technological society will be able to pass those limits by modifying human beings, whether by psychological methods or biological methods or both. In the future, social systems will not be adjusted to suit the needs of human beings. Instead, human beings will be adjusted to suit the needs of the system. 152. Generally speaking, technological control over human behavior will probably not be introduced with a totalitarian intention or even through a conscious desire to restrict human freedom. Each new step in the assertion of control over the human mind will be taken as a rational response to a problem that faces society, such as curing alcoholism, reducing the crime rate, or inducing young people to study science and engineering. In many cases, there will be a humanitarian justification. For example, when a psychiatrist prescribes an antidepressant for a depressed patient, he is clearly doing that individual a favor. It would be inhumane to withhold the drug from someone who needs it. When parents send their children to Sylvain learning centers to have them manipulated into becoming enthusiastic about their studies, they do so from a concern for their children's welfare. It may be that some of these parents wish that one didn't have to have specialized training to get a job and that their kid didn't have to be brainwashed into becoming a computer nerd. But what can they do? They can't change society, and their child may be unemployable if he doesn't have certain skills. So they send him to Sylvain. Thus, control over human behavior will be introduced not by a calculated decision of the authorities,
But through a process of social evolution, rapid evolution, however, the process will be impossible to resist because each advance considered by itself will appear to be beneficial, or at least the evil involved in making the advance will seem to be less than that which would result from not making it. See paragraph 127. Propaganda, for example, is used for many good purposes, such as discouraging child abuse or race hatred. Sex education is obviously useful, yet the effect of sex education, to the extent that it is successful, is to take the shaping of sexual attitudes away from the family and put it into the hands of the state as represented by the public school system. 154. Suppose a biological trait is discovered that increases the likelihood that a child will grow up to be a criminal, and suppose some sort of gene therapy can remove this trait. Of course, most parents whose children possess that trait will have them undergo the therapy. It would be inhumane to do otherwise, since the child would probably have a miserable life if he grew up to be a criminal. But many or most primitive societies have a low crime rate in comparison with that of our society, even though they have neither high-tech methods of child rearing nor harsh systems of punishment. Since there is no reason to suppose that more modern men than primitive men have innate predatory tendencies, the high crime rate of our society must be due to the pressures that modern conditions put on people, to which many cannot or will not adjust. Thus, a treatment designed to remove potential criminal tendencies is at least, in part, a way of re-engineering people so that they suit the requirements of the system. Our society tends to regard as a sickness any mode of thought or behavior that is inconvenient for the system. And this is plausible because when an individual doesn't fit into the system, it causes pain to the individual as well as problems for the system. Thus, the manipulation of an individual to adjust him to the system is seen as a cure for a sickness and therefore as a good. Michael Sarian has 3 words he uses for this. Unsane. Unsane is everyone that's operating within the system, functioning well within the system. So they're in the matrix. Sane are the people that break away, individualize, and see the flaws of the system in the matrix and see their way out. And then insane are people beyond that, beyond just seeing through the matrix. In paragraph 127, we pointed out that if the use of a new item of technology is initially optional, it does not remain optional because the new technology tends to change society in such a way that it becomes difficult or impossible for the individual to function without using that technology. This applies also to the technology of human behavior. In a world in which most children are put through a program to make them enthusiastic about studying, a parent will almost be forced to put his kid through such a program, because if he does not, the kid will grow up to be, comparatively speaking, an ignoramus and therefore unemployable. Or suppose a biological treatment is discovered that, without undesirable side effects, will greatly reduce the psychological stress from which so many people suffer in our society. If large numbers of people choose to undergo the treatment, then the general level of stress in society will be reduced, so that it will be possible for the system to increase the stress-producing pressures. In fact, something like this seems to have happened already with one of our society's most important psychological tools for enabling people to reduce or at least temporarily escape from stress, namely mass entertainment. Our use of mass entertainment is optional. No law requires us to watch television, listen to the radio, read magazines. Yet, mass entertainment is a means of escape and stress reduction on which most of us have become dependent. Everyone complains about the trashiness of television, but almost everyone watches it. A few have kicked the TV habit, but it would be a rare person who could get along today without using any form of mass entertainment. Yet, until quite recently in human history, most people got along very nicely with no other entertainment than that which each local community created for itself. Without the entertainment industry, the system probably would not have been able to get away with putting as much stress-producing pressure on us as it does. Assuming that industrial society survives, it is likely that technology will eventually acquire something approaching complete control over human behavior. It has been established beyond any rational doubt that human thought and behavior have a largely biological basis. As experimenters have demonstrated feelings such as hunger, pleasure, anger, and fear can be turned on and off by electrical stimulation of appropriate parts of the brain. Memories can be destroyed by damaging parts of the brain, or they can be brought to the surface by electrical stimulation. Hallucinations can be induced or moods changed by drugs. There may or may not be an immaterial human soul, but if there is one, it clearly is less powerful than the biological mechanisms of human behavior. For if that were not the case, then researchers would not be able so easily to manipulate human feelings and behavior with drugs and electrical currents. It presumably would be impractical for all people to have electrodes inserted into their heads so that they could be controlled by the authorities. But the fact that human thoughts and feelings are so open to biological intervention shows that the problem of controlling human behavior is mainly a technical problem, a problem of neurons, hormones, complex molecules, the kind of problem that is accessible to scientific attack. Given the outstanding record of our society in solving technical problems, it is overwhelmingly probable that great advances will be made in the control of human behavior. Will public resistance prevent the introduction of technological control of human behavior? It certainly would if an attempt were made to introduce such control all at once. But since technological control will be introduced through a long sequence of small advances, there will be no rational and effective public resistance. To those that think this all sounds like science fiction, we point out that yesterday's science fiction is today's fact. The Industrial Revolution has radically altered man's environment and way of life, and it is only to be expected that as technology is increasingly applied to the human body and mind, man himself will be altered as radically as his environment and way of life have been. Okay, that's the end of paragraph 160. We'll hold there and move on to the questions and trivia from last episode, and we'll pick up at 161 and finish in episode 3. Well, I can't say enough how much I'm getting out of re-reviewing this and researching these sections in a little more detail for each episode. But a couple things I'd like to just point out before we move to the trivia section. One is that the family of pharmaceuticals I was trying to think of that started as a cure for ADD and then moved into military missions, use for military missions, and then students using it for cramming for exams, is called nootropics. There's some that are over-the-counter and some that are pharmaceuticals. The other point I wanted to make was that in the YouTube video, the German YouTube video that I'll share again on this post, they do a great job talking to a couple of scientists. One of the bomb victims, actually, they did a great job. He had a book and a simulation of sorts, a software simulation called Mirror World, I believe it was. And his idea was to set up a civilization in software that ran itself, and that once you kicked it off, you couldn't control it. And he was one of the bomb victims. So they just did a really good job of kind of scanning many aspects of this case. And two of the scientists they interviewed, well, the German, I think he was a physicist, really made a good point at the end around the limits of science, that we fool ourselves into a false notion of confidence around our scientific method and our scientists and their latest findings. But he really made a great point that essentially a lot of the new quote-unquote innovations are terms to explain scientific dynamics that we can't explain. So he used the example of particles. Particles got invented to explain dynamics that we can't explain. So every time you run into something you can't explain, you explain it with the particle theory. He was really quite engaging and entertaining. But the other one was actually the Unabomber himself, who was, as I mentioned in the last episode, an accomplished mathematician. He didn't just allude, he explicitly said that advanced abstract mathematics becomes a fraud at its limits. I mean, he said something along those lines. And he said you really have to take it to its limits before you see the cloak and dagger games that are going on with advanced abstract mathematics. So I thought that was fascinating. He didn't cite any specifics, but I mean, this is a guy that knows what he's talking about on that particular topic. The idea that we do kid ourselves about our limits of our scientific knowledge and understanding. The last one is, I think this is one of the strongest pointers that there's much more going on with this story than the press is letting on. For one thing, they admit in the case and in the TV series, and it goes into more detail in that documentary, but he was psychological experiments at Harvard by a World War II experienced psychological experimenter. So, I mean, just the links and ties with even Timothy Leary was connected in some way, and then this doctor who had World War II experience, and then it really seems like they're half winking, telling you that this was a setup. I mean, a time bomb designed and released by the authorities. But the other one I think is this probably the strongest pointer that there's more going on is the actual name. So Unabomber. They named him Unabomber before they knew if he was one or many, and he was referring to himself in his writings as a plural, as a, I think it was Freedom Committee, and he still to this day refers to that group as a group, and yet they named him Unabomber before, and that stuck, and they kept it. They claim it was an acronym or an abbreviation for University and Airline Bomber, but I mean, obviously, Unabomber, what they were really trying to tell the world, and to this day, trying to tell the world, is that he's a lone gunman. And so, kind of makes you think, if they go to that much trouble to name him the lone gunman, that there's more going on. Okay, that's it for this talk on this topic on this episode. Let's move on into the questions and answers and wrap it up, and then wrap the whole story up next week. So the questions from last episode are as follows. Number 1, what are the 4 main tenets of modern Satanism? Number 2, what, if any, relationship is there between morality and freedom? Number 3, what are the key distinctions or litmus tests between a culture, a religion, and a cult? How do you know when your social circle or community is one of these? Number 4, what are the 8 pillars of Buddhism, the Eightfold Path? And number 5, what are the 14 signposts to slavery as shared audiobook, None Dare Call It Conspiracy? And the authors are listed here in the show notes, the authors of the signposts. So, number 1, modern Satanism. What are the 4 main tenets of modern Satanism? Here's the answer. Number 1, egotism. Service to self is life's highest goal. Now, this is such an important point, these 4. There's more in-depth information here in the notes, but I'll just focus on answering the questions. Service to self. So people think this is a Hollywood creation, but they think of conjuring entities and dark practices and rituals and all those things. That does exist, but the actual belief system is listed here. Egotism, service to self is life's highest goal, number 1. Number 2, moral relativism. Right and wrong are whatever human beings say they are. Number 3, social Darwinism. The most dominant and cruel humans should become the masters and rule humanity. Number 4, eugenics, epi-eugenics. The masters should determine who is allowed to live and who must die. If you really think about it, this is the value system the entire society is shifting to. I was going to say Western society, but it's not just Western society. It's definitely second world as well. And so there are Satanists who know what the practices are and what the faith is, quote unquote, but there's a large majority of the population who are basically mini-me Satanists. They have the value system in a lower level, and that's how they're living their life on a daily basis, and they don't even know that they are They're little mini-me Satanists. Okay, next question is the relationship between freedom and morality. Freedom and morality are directly proportional. True freedom can never exist in a society that embraces moral relativism. Moral relativism is the idea that there is no objective difference between right and wrong, and human beings can arbitrarily create or decide what right and wrong are for themselves. So as morality increases, freedom increases. As morality declines, freedom declines. And you've got an entire population of people that couldn't even define right and wrong. They don't even know what morality is anymore. Well, that's how lost we are. Another way of stating this law would be to say that the presence of truth and morality in the lives of people of any given society is inversely proportional to the presence of tyranny and slavery in that society. So if you want to head straight towards slavery, you subscribe to a belief system called moral relativism. If you want to head straight towards peaceful freedom, you subscribe to natural law and live by the moral belief system embedded in natural law. There's a little bit more here. There's a formula that really works for me. It's the aggregate. The sum of freedom is directly proportional to the sum of morality in the population. Litmus tests for cult community. Several years ago, the founder of International House of Prayer, Mike Bickle, created a list of 7 ways to recognize the difference between a religious community and a cult. Written down, the signs seem clear. I put an asterisk next to my favorites, my personal favorites. Opposing critical thinking. Cult knowledge base is final as is. Number 2, isolating members and penalizing them for leaving, which is known as apostasy. Number 3, emphasizing special doctrines outside Scripture. Number 4, seeking inappropriate loyalty to their leaders, unquestioning. Number 5, dishonoring the family unit unless the family is in the cult. Number 6, crossing biblical boundaries of behavior versus sexual purity and personal ownership. Imagine when we think of cult, we think of charismatic leader, and we think of kind of controlled sexual behaviors, controlled by the leader, which for most people is a sure sign you're going into a dark place. And number 7, separation from the church. This is in the religious context. So the principles of establishing a cult: isolation, indoctrination, and conformity. Next is religion. The ostensible purpose of religion: connect people with God and spirituality, show people a better way of living through a moral way of life. Now, the Latin definition or origins of the word is, I just think of relegate, to tie back, to hold back, to thwart from forward progress, to bind. A false religion is a system of control based on unchallenged dogmatic belief which holds back the progress of consciousness. And then there's some modern religions listed, like scientism and atheism. And then there's a few more comments about cults and some of their techniques. One of them is trauma. One of the principles includes trauma. So that just makes, and I mean, this is my comment on the next Netflix episodes. When they're showing you some graphic violence, I'm always paying attention to what's coming next. I'm trying to. Anyway, let's put it that way. Eightfold Path of Buddhism. Number 1, right understanding. Number 2, right intention. Number 3, right speech. Number 4, right action. Number 5, right livelihood. Number 6, right effort. Number 7, right mindfulness. Number 8, right concentration. They're listed there in a few different formats, but that's essentially the list. And finally, the signpost to slavery. This was shared in a wonderful little book that was published in 1972 called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. It was authored by Gary Allen with Larry Abraham, and it was considered controversial to have been a blueprint for the future of America. That America is perhaps where we are all living today. If you doubt the possibility of a conspiracy to bring America to its knees and perhaps install a totalitarian dictatorship through the conversion of our republic into a democracy, you need only look at the changes in our laws. Gary Allen provides his readers with 14 signposts on the road to totalitarianism. They were compiled by Dr. Warren Carroll and Mike Djorkovic, a refugee from Yugoslavian communism. The list is in no particular order. However, nothing on the list existed in American law at the time the list was compiled. Read it now, experience it for yourself. Any one of the listed items would be a clear warning that the totalitarian state is very near, and a significant number of perhaps 5 or more could possibly suggest that the freedom we have once enjoyed and the preservation of our great republic has been lost. 14 signposts to slavery. 1. Restrictions on taking money out of the country and on the establishment or retention of a foreign bank account by an American citizen. Number 2. Abolition of private ownership of handguns. Number 3. Detention of individuals without judicial process. Read Julian Assange. Number 4. Requirements that private financial transactions be keyed to Social Security numbers or other government tax ID numbers so that government records of these transactions can be fed into a computer. Number 5. Use of compulsory education laws to forbid attendance at presently existing private schools. Number 6. Compulsory non-military service. Number 7. Compulsory psychological treatment for non-government workers or public school children. Number 8. An official declaration that anti-communist patriot organizations are subversive and subsequent legal action taken to suppress them. Number 9. Laws limiting the number of people allowed to meet in a private home. Number 10. Any significant change in passport regulations to make passports more difficult to obtain. Number 11. Wage and price controls, especially in a non-wartime situation. Number 12. Any kind of compulsory registration with the government of where individuals work. Number 13, any attempt to restrict freedom of movement within the United States. Number 14, any attempt to make a new major law by executive decree, that is, actually put into effect, not merely authorized as by existing executive orders. Now, if that isn't a list of everything that's going on right now, I don't know what to tell you. So there was a good little commentary. I'd like to quickly go through this as to where it was as of January 1972. President Nixon invoked numbers 1, 11, and 14 as of January 1st, 1972. Banks must report to the government any deposit or withdrawal over $5,000. That number has since been reduced to $3,000. Any purchase over $10,000 made in cash must also be reported to the federal government. Clinton has done the same via executive orders. Courts have, in some instances, ordered individuals without bank accounts to open one under threat of incarceration through charges of civil contempt. This government is presently attempting to end private handgun ownership in America through federal legislation. That is signpost number 2. Recent destruction of habeas corpus has made signpost number 3 a reality. Federal banking laws have made signpost number 4 the law of the land. Number 3 is detention of individuals without judicial process. Number 4 is requirements of private financial transactions be keyed to a federal ID number. President Clinton's America in Service, quote-unquote, legislation has made signpost number 6 an expected part of American behavior. Federal civil rights legislation in regard to helping young children deal with alternative lifestyles of adults, Susie's Two Mummies and Daddies, has made signpost number 7 part of the new American landscape. Increased fees and much extended waiting times are now required to obtain a passport, which is signpost number 10. The EPA's trip reduction legislation, which limits individuals' rights to travel freely on the highway, is a perfect example of signpost number 13. Roadblocks or checkpoints set up by either local or state police under the guise of searching for drugs or drunk drivers while appearing to be in the service of society are in truth an invasion of our freedom to travel. Well, we have already seen 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. Signpost 8 is up for grabs. 8 is official declaration that patriot organizations are subversive. and 5, 6, 7, and 9 may take a little more time. The truth speaks for itself. America may be lost. We may now be living under totalitarian rule. Some of us will recognize the truth. Some of us will continue to be in denial of the truth. Too few of us will fight back to regain the freedoms we've lost. The only thing you can be sure of is that this government will continue in its relentless march over whatever may be left of this once great republic until we are all slaves in the land our fathers fought to make free. Winston Churchill, speaking to the English people as they were about to become involved in World War II, proclaimed, "If you will not fight for right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment where you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival." Because the American people have ignored warning after warning, we have finally come to the place in time where we are beginning to ask where our freedoms have gone. Unless we begin to take action now against unconstitutional acts on the part of our elected public servants, we will face a future choice also described by Mr. Churchill. He said, "There may be even a worse fate. You may have to fight when there's no hope of victory, because it is better to perish than to live as slaves." To study the whys and the wherefores of our present condition, I suggest Enemy, the State. Our Enemy, the State, by Albert J. Nock, 1935, his classic and brilliant critique distinguishing government from the state. In the same vein, tracing the path of state from tyranny to freedom and back again to tyranny, I suggest The Law by Frederick Bastiat, 1850, another much ignored classic expose of all socialist tendencies in the functioning of government. All right, let's do the questions for next episode. Questions for next episode. Why does it make complete sense that Satanists, now that you know what their tenets are, their 4 tenets, that Satanists worship death and suffering? 2, how can you have a true personal relationship, friend or family member or love interest, that isn't rooted in service to truth as its highest value? Number 3, in the mystery traditions, what word is referred to as the lost word? Number 4, what's the definition of natural law or God's law? Number 5, what's the definition of a natural-born human right, or by corollary, a wrong? And finally, number 6, what's agape? What's the meaning of the word agape, and where has this word gone? Thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed. We will wrap the Unabomber story next episode. Please browse on over and explore the different supporting links that were mentioned in the show at synthesismeaning.me, podcast section episode 2. There's also a recommended vendor product I've been really happy with, Bombay Shirt Company, online custom shirts. So it's an interesting combination. So enjoy all that, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks a lot.
Over and over again. always be big in your mind. Never let them push you down. They'll say